down, the lander will go through several measures to make sure its liquid methane and liquid oxygen engine is safe. And then flight controllers will prioritize vehicle health data before sending images, approximately 2 hours after landing.
And right now, flight controllers are monitoring Athena's health and trajectory ahead of her autonomous landing sequence. That begins with powered descent initiation at approximately 11:16 a.m. Central Time for a landing at approximately 11:30 a.m. Central. From this angle, you can see a large monitor on the wall inside of Mission Control. What they're looking at is up on your screen right now. It's the room's situational awareness tool called the Viz, directly in front of the mission and activity directors.
The Viz is an animation representing real-time telemetry data feeding into Nova Control. Nova Control receives the data and runs it through a video game software, then generates a visualization of that data. It's a useful tool for keeping track of what Athena is doing in space. The white line you see right now is pointing to the moon. There are also some other color lines you might see pop up, like a blue line, that's the past and intended trajectory. The yellow and the green lines are pointing toward the sun and the earth, respectively. And at different points during landing, you might see some different color cones appear. Those are antenna arrays used for line-of-sight communication back to Earth. We're going to show the Viz periodically throughout this show to check in on Athena, and we intend to leave the Viz up during landing to give you the most accurate information possible.
And Leah, let's go ahead and use that tool now. We have a screen off to the side here, and it looks like Athena is about 72 kilometers above the lunar surface, continuing to decrease her altitude over the next hour until firing her engine one more time for landing. Again, that landing time is expected at 11:31 Central Standard Time, 12:31 Eastern. The countdown clock at the top of your screen is counting down to that time, and we expect to remove the countdown clock approximately 2 minutes before the landing opportunity. Now, getting to this moment has been quite the journey, especially over the past 7 days in space since liftoff from Launch Complex 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center.
Athena lifted off at 7:16 p.m. Eastern Standard Time from atop a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket on February 26th. Approximately 43 minutes later, Athena entered a translunar orbit, which is a direct shot at the moon. Over the next few days, Athena completed small engine firings to refine her trajectory before flight controllers commanded lunar orbit insertion on March 3rd to place the lander approximately 100 kilometers, or about 62 miles, above the lunar surface. For 3 days in lunar orbit, she has prepared to make her journey down to the lunar surface.
The journey to low lunar orbit took firing Athena's liquid methane and liquid oxygen engine 4 times, including one 7.5-minute burn to get into the moon's orbit. Over the last 24 hours, Athena has maintained her trajectory in low lunar orbit, waiting for suitable lighting conditions on the moon's surface to begin her autonomous descent to Mons Mouton, the designated landing site for the IM-2 mission near the south pole of the moon. And we did get to see some of that video, Leah. Rugged, but potentially the future of humanity down there on the South Pole.
Yeah, I can't wait to see what we find once we get there. And of course, this mission is called IM-2 for a reason. Just over a year ago, on February 22nd, 2024, Intuitive Machines became the first American commercial company to land on the lunar surface, touching down at the South Pole of the moon in Malapert A. The Nova C-class lunar lander was known as Odysseus. It broke a piece of landing gear as it touched down and tipped over, but still delivered and operated the payloads aboard for their intended duration. Now, due to lighting conditions at the South Pole, lunar landings in that area are limited for how long they can operate. The spacecraft gathered solar power for 7 days prior to shutting down and completing the mission. Our joint coverage today will follow Athena through her descent and landing on the lunar surface, carrying 10 payloads with her, including 3 from NASA. This mission is enabled under a task order with NASA's Commercial Lunar Payload Services Initiative. Here's more on how this project operates under Artemis.
Our moon. It seems so close in the night sky, but getting there is really hard. But what if there was a way to change that? Only a few nations have successfully landed on the moon. As NASA sends astronauts back to the lunar surface, this time to stay, we will need to send science and technology instruments ahead of time to lay the foundation for human exploration. To make this happen, NASA is helping establish a commercial lunar economy. For the first time ever, there will be commercial delivery services to the moon. We are enabling American companies to send our payloads to the lunar surface for us. These delivery services will expand our capabilities for exploration, radically increasing the amount of science we can achieve. This high-risk, high-reward initiative will invest in and leverage the entrepreneurial spirit of American innovation to launch a commercial lunar marketplace, advancing technology and exploration for all of us. With this never-before-seen streamlined access to the moon, we will be able to make novel measurements and develop technologies that scientists have long wanted to do on the lunar surface. And as this new industry matures, this commercial delivery service for NASA and other customers could expand beyond the moon to other destinations in our solar system. And we can learn to live on another world because we are explorers.
For more on how CLIPS contributes and fits in with our plan to land humans on the moon and Mars, let's head over to NASA's Antonio Jaramillo just down the hall.
Hey, thanks, Leah. Joining me is Joel Kearns, the Deputy Associate Administrator for Exploration with NASA Science Mission Director. Joel, we're getting ready for our second moon landing in less than a week. I mean, what an exciting time.
Well, it certainly is. I mean, we've had the launch of IM-2 on last Wednesday, and then very early Sunday morning, we had the successful landing of Blue Ghost Mission 1 from Firefly. It's really, I'm over the moon at this point. Yeah.
You know, talking now about this specific mission for IM-2, can you tell us why some of the specific science and technology instruments were selected for this mission, and then also for the first mission for Intuitive Machines?
Yeah. So Intuitive Machines' first mission, NASA primarily selected scientific instruments. As a matter of fact, we left it up to Intuitive Machines to pick out which NASA scientific instruments that we had available for the moon they would fly on IM-1. But this mission is really different. It's not just Intuitive Machines' second flight of their Nova C model lunar lander, but this mission is almost focused exclusively on technology development payloads instead of scientific instruments. So the payloads that are on Intuitive Machines 2 will really test out and demonstrate new technologies that will be used in the future by scientists, by people that develop exploration systems, and by people that do operations in space. So it's got a really different character than IM-1.
You know, that's really fascinating. I can't wait to discover what we learn once we're on the moon. Now, Joel, can you tell us why is it important that we have these different CLIPS contracts with the different commercial providers?
Well, you know, for a number of reasons. One is that we, of course, when we buy a service, we want to be able to have competition so that we can get the best service at the best price the fastest we can. But even more than that, by having a number of different companies develop these CLIPS service landers, we're able to see the different strengths and the different entrepreneurial ways that they develop new techniques just for their lander, and it gives overall a much better suite of products for the United States to have. Also, one of our goals on CLIPS, in addition to carrying science and technology on the moon, is to generate a group of companies in the U.S. that are very good at landing things on the moon, so the U.S. government can buy that service, or other foreign companies or governments could also buy that service from the U.S.
You know, Joel, thank you so much for joining us here today. Now we'll send it back to our hostess, to Leah and Josh.
Thanks, Antonia. We're following along with Athena's descent toward the lunar surface. I'll glance over at the viz, and it looks like she's continuing to decrease her altitude until powered descent initiation. She's right about 58 kilometers, but we expect PDI in approximately 36 minutes. That's powered descent initiation. That is a main engine firing that takes about 12 minutes. It's designed to slow Athena's speed in preparation for final descent moments before touchdown. The time of ignition for PDI is 11:15 a.m. Central Time, and that's 11 a.m., 12:15 a.m. p.m., Eastern. The entire landing sequence is autonomous, meaning the lander is in control of every milestone required for a lunar landing opportunity, although flight controllers do have the ability to intervene minutes before touchdown.
And completing a soft touchdown on the lunar surface comes with unique challenges because there is no atmosphere.
That's right. It's not quite Mars just yet, Leah. For now, it's an entirely different playbook.
Let's take a look at the IM-2 mission's complete trajectory approach and what Athena is expected to do on the surface.
Athena's mission may provide the wisdom required to define how will humanity live and work on the moon.
These kind of questions, where we go from being observers of the moon to builders on the moon, this is the first step to beginning to answer those kinds of questions.
Her route to unlocking the moon's secrets follows the same path as an old friend.
Odysseus lunar lander separation confirmed.
Small engine firings refine Athena's trajectory before approaching lunar orbit.
We have to do what's called a lunar orbit insertion. It's about a 900 meter per second maneuver. It's a big burn.
In orbit, Athena checks on her payloads, including Lone Star's data center, and manages extreme heat in the light and frigid cold in darkness.
We're just going in orbit, doing the things you do with satellites. This will be very similar to what we do with our orbit and comm relay satellites, starting with IM-3.
A short engine firing sends Athena into a lower orbit to prepare for one final 600-second burn maneuver to the surface.
And it's a nice ride. The engine provides a steady level of thrust that does pick up a little bit as we deplete fuel, but we control it.
Finally, Athena's true mission, delivering technologies, science, and services that may enable humanity to live, work, and explore deeper into the solar system.
It's definitely a great feat. But once you're there, you want to expand from that landing spot and go and look at different things.
For approximately 10 days, Athena is designed to support NASA's Prime 1 drill suite, deploy a rover, send a rocket-fueled drone into a crater, and connect those spacecraft using Nokia's 4G LTE lunar surface communications system.
We have people that are driven to build and fly and operate space equipment, and that's what we're here for. It's who we are.
Well put from Dr. Crane there, Leah. That is who we are, but let's take a closer look at what we've built.
This mission's Nova C-class lunar lander is named Athena. She's carrying 11 payloads, including NASA and commercial instruments to the moon, and including her solar panels, she's just over 15 feet tall. With the landing gear, she's just shy of 15 feet wide, and that's about the length of a standard car parking spot. The lander weighs nearly 1,500 pounds, with the majority of that weight at the base during landing, and it's capable of delivering about 220 pounds of payload to the lunar surface. And we've got a replica of Athena right here. So Josh, can you walk us through a few of the commercial payloads that are on board for this mission?
Sure. Pretty convenient placement, right? We consider all of these commercial payloads to be pioneers on these early missions. Underneath the garage here, we have Lunar Outpost Map Rover, right, which is also connected to Nokia's 4G LTE system. That's their lunar surface communications system. On the other side, we have another interesting bit. This one is Lone Star's data center, and the lander itself is protected by two innovative technologies from Columbia Sportswear, helping to protect this mission, making sure Athena makes it to her intended destination, Leah.
Athena and her payloads are expected to land on the Mons Mouton region of the moon. This is farther south than any lunar landing attempt ever.
And Leah, that is significant. Just like Earth, there are places on the moon that are like landing in an open field. The South Pole is a different story. This mission's landing site is more similar to landing on a small plateau in the Rocky Mountains, but that's where we think that there's going to be water in future exploration.
Well, to learn a little bit more, let's head to Antonio Jaramillo to learn about this landing site.
Hey, thanks, Leah. Joining me now is Ben Bussey, Intuitive Machines Chief Scientist. Ben, you know, both IM-1 and IM-2 chose the moon's south pole for its landing locations. Why specifically the South Pole?
So the lunar poles are interesting for both scientific and exploration regions. We know because of the moon's tilt that the craters near the pole are permanently shadowed. They never see the sun. So they're extremely cold, and we believe that water and other volatiles could build up inside those craters and in the polar region, and that represents a resource for future robotic and human exploration. And also the poles are sort of lunar incognita in that they've been relatively underexplored. If you think back to the Apollo era of exploration, that was all sort of equatorial, and so there's still a lot to learn about them.
Absolutely. And so can you tell us then a little bit then what's different then from both the landing locations of IM-1 and IM-2, even though they're in a similar area?
I would say there are more similarities than differences between the two landing sites. The poles are a challenging location in that when you look at the moon, you have sort of the dark regions that you see, which in Latin are the seas and the lakes. They're relatively flat terrain. But we want to explore the poles. The poles are what they call highland terrain, more rugged, low sun angle, which makes them challenging. And so IM-1 landed about 80 degrees south. It's also the location that the NASA with Artemis wants to send crew. So we're gradually working our way towards the poles. We're about twice as close to the pole with IM-2, about 85 degrees south, about 160 kilometers, 100 miles away from the South Pole.
And now, you briefly touched on it, but can you discuss some more the challenges of landing in the South Pole?
Yes, so I think when the team picks a landing site, there are really three parts to that. The first part, the most important part, is it has to be a safe landing site. The moon doesn't have, doesn't have atmosphere. It has hazards. You can't avoid craters, and so you have to have the capability to avoid them during the final part. You also have to avoid the boulders. So the first step is going to be a safe landing site. The second part is, are you going somewhere where the instruments and the payloads that you're flying, can they achieve the science or the technology goals that they want to do? And that's one of the reasons we've picked the site that we have. And the third, one of the reasons also the poles are challenging, is unlike the near side of the moon where you'd see the Earth all the time and the sun would come up for 14 days and set, the sun is always on the horizon, and you play a sort of a game of orbital mechanics in that you need the sun and the Earth both to be up at the same time, and that changes every month. So the team has to take that into account as well.
A lot of things to take into account. Ben, this is going to be Intuitive Machines' second lunar landing. How are you and the team feeling?
Oh, I think the best way to phrase it is nervous excited. I mean, obviously the landing is exciting and scary, but we're very excited about what we hope the payloads will achieve. One of the payloads, the hopper, is like a mini lander that can fly several kilometers. And one of the reasons the Mons Mouton region, it is one of the Artemis regions, one of the potential regions for crew. We're landing close to a small, permanently shadowed 200-meter crater. We've put instruments on the hopper from Puli Space in Hungary. It's a neutron spectrometer. It'll measure hydrogen. So it'll be the first ever time we've taken a direct hydrogen measurement inside a permanently shadowed crater.
Very exciting times ahead. Ben, thank you so much for joining us. Now we'll send it back to Leah and Josh.
Thank you, Tony and Ben. As a reminder, Intuitive Machines' lunar lander is taking NASA science and technology demonstrations to the moon under the Commercial Lunar Payload Services Initiative. We call it CLPS. Under CLPS, NASA asks commercial companies like Intuitive Machines to provide lunar delivery services that advance capabilities for science, exploration, or commercial development of the moon. This flight will deliver 3 NASA instruments for CLPS, including a drill suite called Prime 1 and a laser retro reflector array, or LRA. These NASA payloads will focus on demonstrating drilling capabilities, investigating resources below the lunar surface, and analyzing surface and subsurface volatiles. As we continue to descend toward the lunar surface, let's take a closer look at these NASA instruments. First is Prime 1, or the Polar Resources Ice Mining Experiment 1. Prime 1 is a collection of 2 instruments that complement each other's work: the Trident Drill, which stands for the Regolith and Ice Drill for exploring new terrain, and M-SOLO, which stands for Mass Spectrometer for observing lunar operations. The Trident Drill will extract lunar soil, also known as regolith, up to 1 meter or approximately 3 feet below the surface. M-SOLO, the mass spectrometer, is designed to analyze the composition of that sample for water and other components. In addition, M-SOLO will measure the composition of gases released near the drill activity. This technology instrument will help demonstrate drilling capabilities that will help scientists understand the on-site or in situ resources that already exist on the moon.
NASA's next payload is the Laser Retroreflector Array, or LRA. It's a collection of 8 retroreflectors similar to the reflectors on your bike that enable precision laser ranging, which is a measurement of the distance between orbiting or landing spacecraft to that reflector that we have on Athena. LRA is mounted on Athena's top deck, so when a laser hits it, it reflects light back to the orbiting spacecraft. And LRA is a non-powered or passive instrument that's intended to function as a permanent location marker for decades on the moon.
Another common theme you'll find among the NASA payloads on IM-2 is helping to demonstrate technologies and our understanding of that lunar landscape that could very well improve operations for landing on the moon in the future. The technology on IM-2 will provide valuable data to help us better understand the moon's surface and allow us to gather insights that will shape the future of lunar resource utilization.
And Leah, using CLIPS as a springboard, Intuitive Machines really based that innovation off of that. We designed and developed a complete lunar program to help support CLIPS and carry out an essential directive underneath that initiative that calls for the commercial development of the moon. That opportunity for Intuitive Machines expanded services outside of NASA payloads, opening doors for commercial industry to achieve those lunar ambitions.
On IM-2, there are 8 commercial payloads flying alongside NASA's Prime 1 drill suite and Laser Retroreflector Array.
That includes commercial payloads from around the world, like Lone Star's data center, a rover from a company based in Japan called Diamond, Columbia Sportsmare, and a couple more we'll touch on here just in a second.
Absolutely. Some additional payloads on board Athena are largely driven by NASA's Space Technology Mission Directorate. These are NASA-sponsored experiments, but developed by private companies. These are also called tipping point awards. These tipping point initiatives are valuable to the lunar economy as we move toward returning to the moon.
And as part of NASA's Tipping Point initiative, Intuitive Machines developed its micronova hopper. We call her Grace, and she's a rocket-fueled drone designed to hop across the lunar surface and into a crater, a place humans and rovers are unable to access. After Athena touches down, Grace is designed to fire her 3 hydrazine engines to lift off from the lander, making her initial landing not too far from Athena. And over the next several days, Grace is expected to make 4 hops, and the 4th hop, Leah, into a crater called Crater H. We intend to rename that crater perhaps with a little bit more personality.
Can't wait to see what you come up with. NASA is interested in what Grace may uncover in the crater because there are regions inside craters that never see light from the sun, and that means they remain extremely cold and could have volatiles like water.
And to detect things like water, Grace is equipped with 2 commercial payloads. One of them is a water snooper from Pulley Space, and another is a lunar radiometer from the German Aerospace Center. We expect Grace to take readings in the shadow crater for about 45 minutes before making one final hop out of that crater to transmit her data back to Athena.
And Grace isn't alone on her mission. She's getting help from another NASA tipping point. To talk about these payloads and the Space Technology Mission Directorate's role in bringing these game-changing technologies to reality, let's send it to NASA's Antonia Jaramillo.
Hey, thanks, Leah. Now joining me is Nikki Werkheiser, Director of Technology Maturations for NASA's Space Technology Mission Directorate. Nikki, can you tell us a little bit more about NASA's Tipping Point initiative and how it's being leveraged on this IM-2 mission?
Of course. So the tipping points are really kind of the heartbeat of what we do in space tech. The whole idea is that technology really enables science and exploration, our commercial ecosystem. So we really want to have, just as much as we want to have exciting new technologies, we want to have new exciting ways to partner and be very agile and really leverage each other's strengths from the government and the commercial side. So the tipping points allow us to do that. So with the tipping points, industry, the companies we're working with, put contributions in. They have internal research funds and development, and then the government puts money in. So we're true partners in creating these capabilities.
Now, specifically on IM-2, why did NASA decide to invest on Intuitive Machines' micronova hopper, or Grace, and then also the Nokia Lunar Surface Communication System?
So I'm glad you asked. So we have something called the Lunar Surface Innovation Initiative, and it was started in about 2019, shortly after Artemis. The whole idea there was, in order to do anything on the moon, you're going to have a set of capabilities or technologies that everyone is going to need. Just your basic infrastructure, if you will. So things like power and surviving, the dust and the environment you're in. But two of the key areas that come up over and over again, of course, are autonomy and robotics and mobility, being able to get around. We all know that there are places on the moon that are more treacherous than others. It's a pretty rough environment. So we have permanently shadowed regions, which you've heard about earlier today that we want to get into. The hopper can do that, right, and get that data and show us what's in there. There's where we think we might have some water or ice. For the communications, that's a no-brainer, right? Every time I talk to, whether it's a second grade class or my grandmother, then they would, when we have our cell phones, when am I going to have my phone on the moon? You have to be able to communicate. Whether you're in your rover and traversing, whether you're in your suit or in your habitat, you have to have a way to be able to communicate. So it's very important that we get this communications established.
And aside from making sure we have communications on the moon, I guess how does NASA determine what other technologies are important to demonstrate on the lunar surface?
Right, so this has been a lot of fun because what we really do is look at the larger, I'm going to say ecosystem of both what NASA wants to do from an architecture perspective, but also from establishing a commercial ecosystem on the moon. So there are certain capabilities that you're going to need, those infrastructure items, if you will. So when you think about living and working somewhere like the moon, I don't know about y'all, but if I go to Walmart, if I go to Florida, I'll have to stop at Walmart and buy my flip-flops, right? You have to prepare for a lot of different things that could happen. So you need that basic infrastructure so you can be more independent from Earth and live and work. So things like power. I mentioned the dust. We learned in Apollo that the dust is very abrasive and very hard on your systems. So we have active, passive, and operational ways to control that. You notice I say dust mitigation, not solutions, because you have to mitigate it. Being able to rove around, being able to have communications, in situ resource utilization, which Prime will be looking at, on how we can use the natural resources where we are instead of being totally Earth dependent. So doing those studies, understanding kind of infrastructure that everyone is going to need is how we pick and prioritize.
So definitely a lot of important technologies. Yes. Nikki, thank you so much for joining us and speaking with us today. Now we'll send it back to Leah and Josh.
Thanks, Tony and Nikki. Here's a deeper look into how the Nokia tipping point will work and the benefits for future missions.
On Earth, a cellular network has many components: base stations, radio units, and a core network that manages the connection between users and the network. Nokia's technology miniaturizes and integrates all of these components into a single network in a box.
This is Nokia Bell Labs Network in a Box that you can hold in your hands. It contains every single component that make up a 4G LTE network. Scaled down to this size, weight, and power, we could install it onto the Intuitive Machines Nova Sea lander, along with specially designed antennas. Every gram that we send to the moon matters. While compact, the system also has many redundancies and fail-safes, allowing it to recover and heal itself. We also overhaul the system software to minimize the impact of ionizing radiation that would normally cause sensitive electronics to malfunction.
The network links directly to devices in both the Lunar Outpost Map Rover and Intuitive Machines Micro Nova Hopper. For the mission to succeed, this network must be fully autonomous. It must deploy and configure itself once on the lunar surface. As the lunar rover goes about conducting experiments, and the hopper goes deep within a crater, the network must also constantly make adjustments to ensure it maintains connectivity.
This is an uncrewed mission. There will be no human technician to tweak or repair the network if something goes wrong. Achieving that level of autonomy was a monumental task to undertake. Working with NASA's Space Technology Mission Directorate, Nokia plans to test the first cellular network on the moon. Success will have implications far beyond this important mission.
In addition to the NASA payloads and tipping point initiatives, Lunar Outpost has another mission objective. Not only will the Lunar Outpost carry the Nokia tipping point demonstration, it will also collect lunar regolith, also known as lunar soil. Lunar Outpost and iSpace have contracts through NASA's Space Operations Mission Directorate for regolith collection. When completed, the companies will provide imagery and location data of the collected material and transfer ownership to NASA.
Now, the purpose of this effort is to show that transfer of ownership from private to public. Lunar Outpost Map rover will be on IM-2. This rover will also carry the Nokia tipping point demo we just mentioned and traverse the moon. And the company's lunar surface communications system, that's from Nokia, will demonstrate proximity communications between Athena, Lunar Outpost rover, and the hopper.
The Lunar Outpost Map rover aboard the IM-2 mission will also carry a technology from the MIT Media Lab Space Exploration Initiative called AstroAnt, which was tested through STMD's Flight Opportunities program. To change the pace of space, the Science Technology Mission Directorate's Flight Opportunities program works with industry flight providers to rapidly demonstrate promising technologies in reduced gravity and other relevant environments.
And Leah, we're just about 12 minutes from Athena starting her final approach to the lunar surface, and things are moving forward as going into an intense 11-minute main engine firing towards the lunar surface. And to this point, Athena has traveled over 700,000 kilometers up on the Viz over 8 days for this final, very risky maneuver.
Yeah, risky is right. It's no secret that landing on the moon is challenging. Countries around the world have attempted this incredible feat, with some being successful and some not. Of course, the United States has landed on the moon many times, most notably during the Apollo program. But today we're looking for the third landing by a U.S. commercial company enabled under NASA's CLPS initiative. Ahead of these important milestones, let's discuss the challenges of landing on the moon through CLPS. Take a look.
Landing on the moon is hard. We're going back. Under this Artemis program, we're going to be sending humans to the moon for the first time since Apollo. So ahead of humans, we want to get up as much science, exploration, and technology experiments as possible.
So CLPS starts facilitating a lot of the early science, the things we want to learn before we even send humans. CLPS stands for Commercial Lunar Payload Services, CLPS.
The services part is the key element. Ordinarily, when NASA delivers a payload to the surface of the moon, they do it with a commercial partner, but NASA controls the building of the vehicle. Now, we're buying the service of delivery of our lunar payloads to the surface of the moon.
It is a delivery service, akin to a delivery service that you'd have here on Earth.
NASA will provide payloads to a commercial company. They decide how to get it to the moon. They have to develop their own lander, but they also have to manage the entire end-to-end mission.
It's meant to provide affordable, rapid, frequent access to the lunar surface through American companies.
We're funding different companies.
We have commercial companies that are competing to win task orders to deliver our payloads to the surface of the moon.
One of the goals when we started CLPS was to help establish a lunar economy.
Somebody has to do it first, and then it becomes commercially available. Then they're able to crank them up. Then they're able to make it more affordable. And so the lunar surface is just the next frontier for a commercial environment.
But we had to acknowledge up front, all the way through the highest levels of the agency's leadership, that some of them will fail. These missions may not be as successful as a traditional NASA mission.
We have accepted the risk that going through this innovative approach with these commercial companies, that there could be some failures. Some of them are new companies. None of them have ever successfully landed on the surface of the moon. So they're going to learn lessons.
We need to give our vendors the opportunity to learn.
And so that'll help ultimately buy down our risk as these companies learn, okay, what does it take to actually build up the lunar lander, integrate payloads, get to the lunar surface and land safely?
They've been able to demonstrate that they have very, very good technical depth and the ability to design and execute missions. We're willing to take more shots on goal. And we aren't risking human life. And in the big picture, if we're flying missions at 1/10 of the cost of a NASA mission and we fail 2 of them, we still get 8 missions for that same price.
Even with 1 or 2 or 3 failures, this is still a very economical proposition. It's a risk posture which is more risk tolerant than NASA is accustomed to. There's not a single one of these companies that's willing to bet their mission on a coin toss. Every one of them is doing what they can in order to have the most successful mission possible. But the important thing to realize is that risk tolerant does not mean risky. And the rewards are a long-term ability to get payloads to the moon inexpensively, frequently, and rapidly.
We want science, so we can then put more of our resources on even more science, exploration, and technology payloads and get more of a return on investment when we get to the moon.
CLIPS provides tremendous benefit across the scientific and economic communities.
So there's a lot we'd like to learn about the moon to help human habitation and prepare us for missions to Mars and beyond.
So the moon is the first step.
We are coming up on just about 22 minutes from Athena's planned lunar landing attempt. Let's take a live look into Nova Control. Josh, can you tell us what's going on right now inside your Mission Control Center?
Well, flight controllers are all monitoring Athena's flight data in near real time. That means Athena is sending data from nearly 250,000 miles away to ground stations contracted by Intuitive Machines across the globe and into Nova Control. The mission director and landing system experts are looking at a screen called the Deorbit Descent and Landing, or DDL screen. It's used primarily while Athena orbits the moon through to landing. That same data flow is being interpreted through a video game engine to create what we call the viz that you see on your screen right now. Well, we have made some improvements to increase the fidelity and reliability of the viz. We expect to keep it up for you during the landing, although the last few seconds may be an estimation of what's happening, as Athena may lose communications contact, particularly when she pitches over right before vertical descent.
Right now, looking at the viz, it shows Athena approximately 15 kilometers above the lunar surface, so we're getting close. Now, when the lander makes it down to about 10 kilometers, we expect Athena to continuously fire her main engine, throttling down until softly landing on the lunar surface.
And Leah, that final burn is called Powered Descent Initiation, or PDI. Athena must slow down by about 1,800 meters per second, which doesn't mean too much until we typed it into Google. That's about 4,000 miles per hour. That's because she's approaching her landing site coming down from orbit, so she has a lot of lateral speed. You can think of PDI like hitting the brakes on your car in order to make a safe turn. But in Athena's case, that turn is moving into a vertical upright position to start descending down to the lunar surface. PDI should be starting here just in about 6 minutes, I believe. Leah?
The teams here in Nova Control have been working diligently over the past 7-8 days to take us this far. Now, again, only 15 kilometers above the lunar surface. We're following the countdown to Athena's landing attempt, but for now, we're heading back over to Tony Hadamia, who is standing by with NASA's acting administrator, Janet Petro. Tony?
Thanks, Leah. It's always an honor to be joined by NASA leadership, and joining us now is Acting Administrator Janet Petro. Janet, we're getting, 20 minutes until landing. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling super excited. I got a little nervous, fingers crossed, toes crossed, but looking forward to it.
Absolutely. I have everything crossed too. Can you tell us a little bit more about the challenges of landing on the moon, especially for these uncrewed robotic spacecraft?
Yeah, so even, you mentioned these are uncrewed, but even back in the Apollo days, the 7 times we landed on the moon, it was very, very challenging, required a whole bunch of simulations and demonstrations to get that right. And so for the uncrewed, so each lander is unique, so each is developed differently, and the harshness of the environment with no atmosphere, the dust that's going to spring up when it lands, all these conditions make it really, really hard to do it right and get it right. And so one thing I found from the Firefly from last week, all these companies know how hard it is. Their own technology, they've got to have precise propulsion and navigation systems to get them right down on the surface, and it's all automated. We're 238,000 miles away from Earth, so there's no real-time control, so that the systems have got to work perfectly together. So these companies, that they support each other, and I started to say we were at Firefly, and several of the other companies sent them in coffee and donuts because they know how stressful it is for the team as they're coming in for a landing to make it, and hopefully it'll go right. But it is really, really hard to make sure that all the systems are working seamlessly and perfectly, and that as they get closer and closer to the lunar surface, that the rugged terrain that they're about to land on, it all works out. And the South Pole is increasingly challenging with the very, very deep craters that are there. The low level of light and the angle of the sun make that even more challenging. So It's harsh. It's harsh.
It absolutely is, and it's just even more impressive when the teams then are able to land, well. Janet, can you tell us how these commercial then lunar flights that are part of the agency's CLIPS initiative, how are they helping us then in our own Artemis missions when we send humans back to the moon?
Yeah, so I consider them part of the way bigger Artemis missions as we're going back to the moon and then on to Mars, that we talk about all the time. And so CLIPS, the Commercial Lunar Payload Services, I just think it's a brilliant partnership between NASA and innovative companies to come up with their own concepts and ideas and help put forth science and instruments earlier than we're going to be able to get humans on the moon. And we'll be able to learn a lot from these instruments and payloads that we're deploying. Things like, the water ice. Maybe we can find some water ice. Different roving mobility techniques. Of course, looking at all the lunar resources and the drilling, drill baby drill that we're going to do on this mission. So all of that we're going to be able to apply to Artemis when we get humans back on the surface of the moon, and then as we go out to Mars. And again, I think CLIPS is a brilliant partnership. And I mentioned, I believe this administration talks about America first, and I think the way we can do it is by bringing along industry and really dominating the space, whether it's low Earth orbit, whether it's cislunar, or whether it's on the surface of the moon. I think we will continue to push boundaries and make sure that we are first and retain leadership in space.
A lot of exciting science ahead. Janet, thank you so much for joining us today. Now we'll send it back to Leah and Josh.
Thanks, Antonia. It's time to buckle up, space fans, or lean forward in your chair. We just heard the call out for 90 seconds for time of ignition for PDI. Let's go ahead and open up those operational channels so that folks at home can listen as we go in towards PDI, Leah. That's a braking burn coming out of orbit, trying to slow down about 4,000 miles per hour.
Yeah, PDI stands for Power Descent Initiation. So this is really that final commitment that we are coming in for landing. And everything is really going to happen in rapid succession after this 11-minute burn, now just 60 seconds away. The rest of the sequence is only about 2 minutes to touchdown. Can you break that down for us, Josh?
That's right. It's going to be rather quick after we get through this PDI maneuver. You're going to hear things start call out for 45 seconds. After PDI, we'll have pitch over, HDA, vertical descent, and then landing operations. We're just now inside about 30 seconds, standing by for that time of ignition for PDI. 30 seconds.
And with 30 seconds, we are now 13 kilometers above the moon. Again, we're going to bring it back down to 10 and start that burn.
We might be
AFM is in exec mode.
I was just about to say we're listening for exec mode here.
15
seconds.
RCS settling burn.
Settling burn. That's our attitude control system.
Ignition commanded.
Ignition and main stage.
All right, let's go ahead and start our stopwatches here.
Cameras are running.
We'll be listening for that max thrust.
AFM mode is breaking 1.
Chamber pressures look nominal.
Good calls. They're not going in at 100% here, Leah. They're going in about 90% in case they need a little bit more oomph on this braking burn.
Again, this is about
good control.
About an 11-minute burn, but the engine does not cut off at the end of this burn. It just continues to throttle down until we land softly on the lunar surface.
And we're listening in to hear some good confirmations of data. If you hear good confirmation of data, that means that that data is making its way to the viz, what you're watching right now on your screen. We do expect to lose some of those communications, especially during that pitch over maneuver at the end of PDI. That's when the lander will be changing its attitude and maybe those antennas aren't pointed directly back to Earth. It's something we expect, something we plan for. But one thing that's unique to the lunar South Pole is what's called multipath, and that's when you have radio waves reaching their intended destination back at Earth after they're taking a different route, maybe bouncing off a crater or a ridge. So we do expect less than optimal radio signals on the surface, but that's something we have to plan for, and it's something that's reflected inside the viz here. So if the viz does lose communications, it's going to continue moving in its last estimated vector. So Folks at home, you might be seeing the lander touch down on the surface, but the ultimate call of confirmation and what is happening is going to come from that mission director seat. You see it in the small box on the bottom right hand of your screen. That's Dr. Tim Crane in the mission director seat today.
Coming up on 1 minute and 45 seconds since the start of the burn, again, an 11-minute burn using the main engine aboard Athena. And if you're watching the viz and it looks like Athena is traveling parallel essentially to the lunar surface, that's because it is. This is a braking burn. Confirmation 2 minutes in, and a better picture on the viz that shows just
chamber pressure still nominal.
Continuing to get good calls, but the next step will be pitch over. So during that pitch over time frame, Athena will begin to upright itself and prepare to descend down to the lunar surface, and also activate HDA, or hazard detection and avoidance. Can you break that down for us too?
Yeah, we touched on this at the top of the show, Leah. We are going in at about 450 meters for PDI versus our originally planned 400 meters, and that's because we had some uncertainty and variability within the recent landing measurements, going in about 50 meters higher, allowing those flight controllers to manually confirm and screen alternative measurements. But we do expect that our estimated landing time will stay closer towards that estimated 11:30 Central Time. That's 12:30 Eastern. And right now we're standing by, just about to hit 3 minutes into this burn. We're listening.
3 minutes in.
There it is. How about that? And we're listening in to hear for things about how many kilometers uprange we may be. We know this braking burn will continue to happen until about 2 kilometers from our intended landing site. Now that intended landing site is where Athena...
Still processing good depause.
Hey, that's a good call. All right, folks at home, that depause is that delta position, meaning the lander is taking pictures in flight, and she's comparing those two pictures together to determine how much have I moved and figure out how fast did I get there in order to affirm that Athena's going in the right direction, making the right moves going forward. Another good thing about depause, we're getting good comm. So on your screen at home and you're looking at the viz, you're looking at, what is this, about 16 meters. That may be off, about 16 meters. We'll stand by for a call out to confirm maybe altitude as well as distance to the landing site. But if they're getting good depause, they have good comm. Again, we do expect, plan, and train for a loss of comm right around the pitch over time frame, and maybe also as well as we descend towards the lunar surface, making sure that our radios and antennas are in the right config.
490 seconds left in the burn.
490 seconds left in the burn. That's code for, we've been burning for about 4 minutes, Leah. We'll stand by to try to get some more data and call-outs here, maybe some kilometers up range, as well as the mixture ratio, trying to figure out the vehicle's performance, that mixture of liquid methane and liquid oxygen going into the engine. Let's take a second and listen in to flight controllers here.
GNC 174 acknowledged.
It's a different mode inside of the guidance, navigation, and control software called out from Michaela Landivar, if I'm not
Chamber
mistaken.
pressures and temperatures still nominal.
Nominal temperatures. This
450 seconds left in the braking.
450 seconds left in a braking.
5 minutes in.
Code for 5 minutes in.
Again, this is a braking burn, the powered descent initiation, really committing us to our final descent. Earlier this morning, we had the DOI, or the descent orbit insertion, which got us out of lunar orbit itself. And since then, Athena has been completely autonomous. So Josh, is there anything right now that flight controllers can still command on the spacecraft?
That's a good point. I mean, there is an autonomous process that is bringing Athena from descent orbit insertion, triggering powered descent initiation, and then through to the lunar surface. Flight controllers do have a few options to manually intervene. We talked about allowing a little bit of extra time with that additional 50 meters for
400
PDI.
seconds left in braking.
400 seconds left in braking. We're almost up on 6 minutes inside of this burn. But that extra 50 meters is allowing flight controllers to manually confirm and screen alternative measurements, as we did have a little bit of uncertainty and variability with recent landing measurements. By my count, we're just crossing about 6 minutes, Leah.
That means we're
GNC
over.
175 acknowledged.
Another guidance, navigation, and control mode call out there.
We are over halfway into this 11-minute burn using the main engine on Athena.
AFM is in braking 2.
Braking 2, progressing through that PDI count, Leah.
350 seconds left in braking.
350 seconds left in braking, just crossing over the 6.5-minute mark since PDI, powered descent initiation. This is one continuous burn from PDI all the way down to the surface.
VFM mode is depause only.
All right, we're still processing delta position. Those are camera measurements the lander is looking at and making decisions. One of those decisions will be using hazard detection to fly to an intended landing region and then autonomously make those decisions of a safe site, whether that's safe from a boulders or steep slopes. We'll hear those call outs after we pitch over. You'll hear HDA, and that's what we're listening for to figure out where those hazards are and choose a new landing site.
Now over 7 minutes into the burn, this braking burn,
300 seconds left in braking.
specifically 300 seconds left, this braking burn.
Engine is still healthy.
And great confirmation about the engine itself. That engine is bringing
GNC
us.
176 acknowledged.
Engine is bringing us from about 4,000 miles per hour to eventually a soft about 1 meter per second, or about 3 feet per second landing.
And I'm catching a little jitters watching the viz here, so I think folks at home will be seeing the same thing. Remember, this is data being streamed down from a lander that's braking about 4,000 miles per hour, trying to feed that data back 250,000 miles away.
TAL is ebb now at 5 dB.
Just to enjoy a little view.
8 minutes elapsed.
Camera's now in braking 2 mode.
We are still inside of PDI, braking 2 mode.
250 seconds left in braking.
So we cross over 8 minutes into this burn.
Again, about an 11-minute burn. We don't expect the engine to reach full 100% thrust. It's really a throttled approach. This engine is designed to continuously burn in throttle all the way from power descent initiation, which began 8 minutes and 30 seconds ago, through touchdown. This approach is very similar to what we saw for the Apollo descent modules as well.
And it makes a lot of sense. If you go in at 100% and you need a little more, there's nothing left to give, right? We want to come in nominally around 90% and then have a little bit of room to play if we do need to increase the speed of which we're slowing down. You'll hear folks maybe call out the rate of acceleration, but in this case, for us, that's deceleration.
9 minutes elapsed.
Crossing over 9
200
minutes.
seconds left in braking.
Yes, just a couple of minutes left in the braking burn, so another look forward to that rapid succession of events that'll come immediately after braking is complete. We will see pitch over begin. We'll be using those 4 RCS, or reaction control system thrusters, at the top of the spacecraft to reorient Athena before its a final approach, vertical descent, and terminal descent.
And all of those after PDI, Leah, that you just called out, we're expecting those to happen rapidly. We can kind of sit back and let flight controllers really get into what's happening. We'll take a few chances in between to help. There's a LOS on one of the radio systems. Again, expected as we get in towards our pitch over maneuver. Some jitters on the viz.
Coisonic's still showing good data.
That's a second radio. So the first one,
good data on Coisonics.
the first one we heard a loss of
GNC
signal.
177 acknowledged.
The second was a confirmation that the
10 minutes
second
in.
radio, we still have signal. So it's good signal, good data, good viz, and we're watching the show here along with the folks at home.
10 minutes into the burn, so expecting just about a minute more until the end of this braking maneuver.
We expect and plan for pitch over just about 2 kilometers away from the intended landing site. That gives Athena a little bit of time to pitch over and start looking forward using her navigation sensors to detect different hazards, as well as her altitude, to lower down to the lunar surface at approximately 1 meters per second if all goes towards plan. There's LOS as we approach our pitch over. All right, we're approaching 11 minutes into the burn. Local time is 11:26.
AOS on Coisonics.
11 minutes in.
11 minutes in, we heard another call out that we're up on Coisonics. That's our radio system. It's 11:26 local. I'm looking at a pitch over time at 11:27 in about 52 seconds. So we are coming up over to the pitch over, where we expect to have some loss of comms. Earlier we talked about multipath that is very unique to the lunar South Pole, where our radio signals are using multiple ways to get to the same destination, whether that's from bouncing off the harsh terrain or some different polarity issues down there on the South Pole. We expect to have a weaker than normal signal, but we still want to make sure we get that confirmation, Leah. As part of that confirmation, we're going to safe the vehicle, figure out the status there, and then start working on pictures after everything's safe. Maybe around 2 hours after landing, we can cherish that photo.
LOS on Quasonics.
There's that loss of signal on one of the radio systems as we approach 12 minutes into PDI.
Again, the engine will continue to fire, albeit it will continue throttling down as we approach the lunar surface. And a reminder, the Viz is a simulation based on flight data, but if we do lose contact with the lander, which can be expected based on the conditions at the lunar South Pole, we will continue to see projected data on this visualization.
And we're approaching G, as in ground, to 2 minutes. We expect to drop this clock here in 2 minutes and take all of our commands from inside of Nova Control. The bottom right hand of your screen, that's Dr. Tim Crane, our co-founder and Chief Growth Officer, also sitting in as Mission Director for landing this IM-2 mission. Standing by for the latest information. Let's wait one.
Quasonics AOS.
HRN, HGA, HGA2.
Thales AOS.
60 seconds left in braking.
60 seconds left in braking.
And approach. Landing site selected.
Engine at idle.
11 meters cross range, divert.
Quasonics LOS.
There's that loss of signal over pitch over. Stand by, see if we regain that signal. Remember, folks, the Viz that you're watching at home is an estimation of data. It's doing its best. That's a lot of data coming from really far away. All commands and all confirmations come from our mission director at the bottom right hand of your screen.
Again, we are standing by, monitoring the Viz just as you are at home, along with Nova Control.
We are approaching approximately the time that we estimated Athena would touch down on the surface. We did hear a call out for a Quasonics LOS. That is our radio system, something we expect to happen at pitch over. That's prior to a vertical descent and terminal descent. That latest data,
how are we doing on signal?
Is what you're seeing on the Viz. Why don't we go?
We currently are getting our uplink through Hemi 2, and we have a healthy AGC value, so our uplink is coming in strong for Thales. And then for our downlink, we have a strong EBNO at 17 on Green Hilly, and we are currently not seeing our Quasonics. So we are in Quasonics LOS.
All right, that's a Quasonics.
See our signal strong on the spectrum for Thales. I'm not seeing our Quasonics on our spectrum as of yet. FM, what mode are we in?
We approach 17 is the last we've seen.
All right, so that's up on one radio, and they do have a loss of signal in the second.
Fido, I'm looking at the Sense Excel. Do you see the Sense Excel reading? Let me look.
That's a mission director detecting, see if
I
the
am
lander.
seeing he Sense Excel 1G.
So that was the mission director, Tim Crane, trying to figure out what is the vehicle sensing. It has 2 inertial measurement units on board. You can think of those as your inner ear. So when he's asking what is the sensed acceleration, that's what he's asking for, is what is that inertial measurement unit, that inner ear, detecting as far as acceleration.
Again, as we've mentioned, the viz here is just an interpretation of landing.
Yeah, let's go ahead and stay on Nova control. Looks like the viz is hovering. We can't.
Prop, what are you seeing on the engine?
The engine is still in idle at min thrust. We are still seeing chamber pressure.
So we're getting good data. We heard that we have 1 radio up, 1 radio loss of signal. We just heard that we have...
I'm seeing guidance to solution for time to go as increasing, just indicating to me that it is the onboard nav state is not decreasing in altitude.
The good news, the HRN laser is now ready to fire.
So we heard that we have 1 good radio sending down data, 1 that has losses signal. We have prop.
Standing by with a manual command for landed ops.
Yep.
No recommendation at this time.
Yep, we have prop telling us that we have good data. That was someone just commanding. We heard exec mode to go into this firing mode, and someone standing by to get into our landed ops mode. I'll wait for Dr. Crane to confirm here. But if we're pulling down data, we'll see how this goes. It looks like Tim's about ready to jump on the loop and sort out what we saw on the viz versus what the folks inside of Mission Control are seeing on their monitors. It's a good reminder, too, this public channel that we're listening to here in the studio, Leah, and what people are listening to at home, at the landing party at Lone Star Flight Museum.
All right, folks. I'm showing that we are sensing lunar acceleration. So we're on the surface. Let's evaluate.
All right, let's continue to evaluate. I hear we do have a picture from a portion of the descent. Is that right over there? All right, so that's a picture during braking, about 10 kilometers up from the lunar surface that we do have while we wait for a little more information.
We can confirm the engine is still running and therefore needs to be upright. If we were in a different configuration, the engine would have snuffed.
Okay, so we have confirmation. I believe that was from Con that says the engine's still running. This picture you're looking at, the 10 kilometers up during that braking burn, that powered descent initiation, that long burn that brought us 4,000 miles per hour braking burn. Incredible shot.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying as well.
All right, there's another view there. Looks like from this panel, we're looking at the garage. So that's Lunar Outpost Map Rover inside of that square right there, Leah. And this looks like it's probably about the same altitude, maybe about 10 meters above the surface. And one more here for everyone. It's about the same altitude there, maybe a little bit more exposure, but these...
Camera's still running in HRN mode.
These photos came down for us just a few moments ago. Wanted to share those before we jump back into mission control as flight controllers are looking at this dynamic situation and learning.
Yeah, go ahead and put us in landed ops. It looks like we're down. We need to evaluate that situation, and I'd like to get a picture.
As they say, picture it didn't happen.
Hello,
so Dr. Crane's onto it right there. A couple things here, Leah.
FM 3402 was acknowledged. AOS on Thales.
What we're hearing in our ears and what folks at home are listening to are not the only channels
Check your systems.
that mission controllers are working on. It's an engine shutdown notice. We'll see what comes out of this. But they are all on different loops having separate conversations, so all the information that we have, that folks have at home, isn't necessarily the exact vibe inside the room. So we'll stand by and listen in to see what we have here. I did hear Dr. Crane call out that they are getting readings for lunar
Folks are moving
acceleration.
to the post-landing court procedure.
All right, Spark, I'm going to start shutting some stuff off as soon as we can.
Copy. Can you meet me on my loop, please?
Feed lines are inerting.
All right, so if we have enough data to be inerting feed lines, that means the engine's no longer running, and it's a state to bleed off that extra pressure. This is part of that safing bit that we talked about earlier, Leah. Looks like our CEO, Steve Altimus, just stepped into the room. That's in the bottom right hand of the box here, talking to the mission director, Dr. Tim Crane. He just called out telling Spark to turn some things off. That's because we need to remain in a power positive state, Leah, getting that top deck solar array into a spot where we are able to charge, but sometimes you have to turn a few things off to make sure that you're charging and not just burning through that power. All right, by my countdown clock, it's been about 22 minutes since we started that PDI, Leah.
And again, we were anticipating landing at about 11:31 a.m. Central Time, 12:31 p.m. Eastern Time. It can get tricky with communications on the lander when you're in a...
Prop, do we have insight to tank pressure if we turn off the Mogies and the Iggies?
We would, yeah.
All right, that's code for the...
If you turn off Mogies, then we cannot inert or vent the tanks.
Yeah. We can bring them back up though, right?
Yes.
How are my pressures?
They're low at this time.
Okay, turn off the Mogies and the Iggies. Going.
Could we turn everything off except the vent valves?
Yes.
That would be everything except MV103 and MV303.
All right, all this activity is regarding the lander's propulsion system. They're going through deciding on how to vent it. We heard two things there, Leah. We heard Mogies and Iggies. That's our motor engine gimbal system, right? And our Iggies are igniter. So they're working through the process of safing this engine. At the top of the show, we talked about the priorities after touchdown, and being safe was first, followed by pulling down some health status information, and then images. And then just about 3 minutes ago, we heard Dr. Crane go ahead and say,
FM3403 acknowledged.
We'll prioritize images. It's just about 9 minutes after the expected landing. So let's hang tight and continue to watch this problem and challenges unfold inside of mission control. Each one going through, finding this challenge, each one getting solved here. It sounds like they're still working through venting the engine system.
Let's power off the Quasonics until we get a handle on what antenna we're going to pipe it through.
Copy. Quasonics is currently in idle mode.
Good enough, thank you.
Quasonics, that's our radio. There's two radio systems on the lander. It sounds like when we talk about that vehicle health status, we heard some things for prop. Vehicle health status includes being in a power positive state.
Spark 636 acknowledged.
So we are communicating, commanding the lander, and getting acknowledgments back that the lander is behaving as expected. So putting those things together while we wait for confirmation from Dr. Crane. We have an engine that is shut down. We are venting the engine.
Spark 637 acknowledged.
We are getting acknowledged commands from the lander. Standing by for confirmation from Dr. Crane.
And just a recap of some of the timelines so far today, we had power descent initiation start about 25 minutes ago.
FM3406 acknowledged.
Power descent initiation is the braking burn that really committed us to coming down to our landing site today. We were targeting landing at about 11:30 a.m. Central Time, so about 10 minutes ago now. Again, still just standing by for some confirmation from the teams in Nova Control, and hopefully a picture that shows the status of Athena on the lunar surface. Landing site today is Mons Mouton. It is the furthest south target for any landing up into this point.
And pretty credible images we just went through. You know, for those to come down during
Spark 638 acknowledged.
During that landing sequence, showing during that deceleration burn, just about 10 meters, I believe that was, over the surface for those images. See who we have in there. Yep, down towards the bottom right-hand side.
Spark 639 acknowledged.
Of your screen, we keep hearing those acknowledgments of the vehicle receiving our commands as we stand by for the real deciding factor here. Never a dull moment, Leah.
We did hear that they were going into
Spark 640 acknowledged.
Commanded landed ops. So can you walk us through some of what that means? I know that includes safing the engine as well.
Right, so there's different modes that we need to command, right? At the beginning of PDI, we hear the command for exec mode, all right?
Spark 641, acknowledged.
That's executing the burn maneuver, right? When we switch over into landed ops, it's a different setting on the lander in order for us to go through those steps, safing the vehicle first and foremost, that liquid methane, liquid oxygen engine.
Yep, bring it down. Also, FM, I'd like a recommendation on whether or not we keep Talos 1 up or if we bring it down.
It's going to be a decision on up and down for radios based on
bring it down
power.
for now. We're taking the same pictures.
I would not recommend powering down Talos.
He did say pictures.
He did say pictures, yes. So, hoping to see the status of Athena on the lunar surface soon. We were initially expecting pictures would take a couple of hours to come down as the flight teams prioritized downloading data and safing the vehicle, but this will help us better understand the configuration of the lander.
Spark 642, acknowledged.
Every time we hear Michaela come on the tunes
Order,
there,
can you zoom in on this view? Actually, give me the spacecraft view.
Spark 644, acknowledged.
getting all these acknowledgements coming through.
No, take task down.
All right, we're going to see here. Looks like Tim's
Star
got a good
tracker's
spot.
down.
Keep powering down things that we're not using anymore. Mission director looks like he's looking up at the screen. Maybe they're looking at a little bit of data that we do not have in front of us. Still standing by for confirmation. But we've heard a few steps go through the process, venting the lander system, hopefully pulling down data inside of mission control, confirming Athena's status on the surface. And then finally, it sounds like we've heard a couple mentions of pictures. We've shown a couple from that descent stage. And we're just going to keep standing by, looking into Nova Control here in Houston, Texas, just down the street from Johnson Space Center, to find out the situation inside of the IM-2 mission with Athena's touchdown. Again, that was about, nominally, the touchdown time is about 14
Spark
and a half
645
minutes ago.
acknowledged.
Still in contact with the vehicle right now. We know the vehicle has shut down. Its engines are powered down. We are getting acknowledgement transmissions to the vehicle.
All right, team. Keep working the problem. We're shedding power as fast as we can to keep the vehicle in good health. We are generating power. We are communicating through our telemetry radio, and we are working to evaluate exactly what our orientation is on the surface.
Spark 646 acknowledged. Spark 648 acknowledged.
So good confirmations there, right? We know we're getting acknowledgement. We're sending things to the vehicle. We're safing the vehicle. Now it's time to start
Spark
working the challenge of
647
how
acknowledged.
is the vehicle? Which way is it pointed? Earlier in the show, we talked about the different antennas on the vehicle and trying to work those, but we are charging, which is a very key element to this mission. Looks like the room's filling up with our subject matter experts. Just continue working on this challenge to see where we stand.
Spark
Bring them back down.
649 acknowledged.
If you see
DS is back in low rate.
You see folks walking on the bottom right hand of your screen underneath the camera. That's because the room's situational awareness is about a 65-inch TV sitting underneath of there. So what they're pointing at could be data, could be confirmation. A little hard to see from this view, but as you see people exiting the bottom of your screen on the bottom right, there's a television monitor there that's helping them make some decisions. And as we cross over, it's been about 30 minutes since time of ignition for PDI, and we just hit 16 minutes since our nominal landing. If you're just joining us, we know we are sending commands to the vehicle. We have shut off equipment that has not been necessary. We know that we have an engine that has been shut off. We've commanded the vehicle into surface operations. We just heard from Dr. Tim Crane that we are generating power. We're turning things off that are no longer required. We heard one of them being the star tracker. It's one of the tools that we use to figure out Athena's position in space during flight. We're in landed ops. Now we're just standing by to hear what the full situation is. About 16 and a half minutes since nominal landing time. and a little over 31 minutes since Athena commanded her final engine burn.
Spark
PDI.
651 acknowledged.
Like you said, Josh, we are
Order,
communicating.
go ahead and turn on the displays for all the antennas.
We're
Okay, so
communicating.
you're going to see everyone looking up at the screen here. So when they're calling back to order, that's actually
Spark 652
in the
acknowledged.
back left of the bottom right monitor. They're changing screens inside the room, situational awareness, television up front, right in front of the mission director. You just asked to pull up the antenna configurations, trying to figure out
653 acknowledged.
which one's pointing back toward Earth, which might be the best one to use. Towards the top of the show and during PDI, when things got a little spicy, we talked about multipath, Leah, and that's something that we expect to happen on the South Pole. It's something we learned from during IM-1, quite frankly, with Odie. Being on the surface and radio waves taking multiple paths to get to the same destination. Multipath exists down on the lunar surface just because there are so many different ways. So during IM-1, we were sending out signals that were bouncing off the surface, bouncing off of craters, and making their way back to Earth. We took I think it was a Saturday and a Sunday to learn a little bit more about the multipath situation. You mentioned, Leah, Odysseus ended up breaking a leg and then laying down gently on the surface, but that communications does create a problem between multipath and learning about those things. Inside of Intuitive Machines' Lunar Data Network, it's comprised of ground stations all over the globe, the largest one of them being...
Good work so far. What else we got?
The largest one's down in Australia. That is the Parkes Observatory. They call her Miri Yang down there, but that really is what helped us pick up those weak radio signals for IM-1. That's not the dish we're on right now, but it seems like we do have a great connection from the vehicle. I believe that dish we're using right now is GHY6 in Goon Hilly, but I don't have that confirmation right in front of me.
AD, this is Prop. Can you confirm what is getting powered down?
Everything we can right now, Prop.
Copy.
They're powering down these systems aboard the lander because it does take quite a bit of energy to land, but we did hear good confirmation that we are also generating power.
Yeah, all these commands that are going to Spark is code for avionics, right? It's where our power is being allocated on the lander. And we've heard a lot of confirmations of things being turned off. We heard Dr. Crane say we are generating solar power. At last check, we heard mission director call out to look at the antenna configuration on the room's situational awareness model screen, and we're still standing by to see where this is going to go.
Yes, power down the cosonics until we're ready to use it.
About 20 minutes now since our intended landing time today. Again, we were expecting that around 11:30 a.m. Central. Teams in the room in Nova Control, that's here at Intuitive Machines in Houston, Texas, just down the street from Johnson Space Center, continuing to evaluate the status of the spacecraft. Continuing to communicate with the spacecraft itself. And just waiting for potentially a photo that would help us confirm its orientation.
I'm just going to wait one and listen in for a couple cues coming into the studio here. Bear with us, folks. Thanks again, folks, for joining us for the IM-2 missions landing coverage. I want to go over a few things we do have coming into the studio, into our ear, that we can confirm while the folks are working inside of mission control on their own challenges, but a couple things that we do have that we can confirm. Athena is on the surface of the moon. The team is going through the process of powering down systems that are not required. We heard the mission director call out that we do have solar charging, so we continue to hear them in our ear that they're turning off different systems that are not required. We are working to figure out the orientation of the vehicle, which is important because those are our antenna systems that will determine how much signal we're going to have and when we can start bringing down things like vehicle health data and other images that can help us to confirm. But we are communicating with the vehicle. We've heard throughout our intended landing time, through now different call outs, making it to the vehicle. We have direct communications contact, and we would tend to bring out some more information as we continue to assess this dynamic situation inside of mission control. We intend to have a press conference at 3 o'clock Central Time. That's 4 o'clock Eastern. We'll do it right over at Johnson Space Center, Leah.
That's right. Thanks for joining us today.
And we'll have plenty of other information if anything else comes out on our website, as well as our X feed to keep everyone up to date. Thanks for joining us, folks.
Usually I have my thumb in the way.
There's no denying that some of the things from the Apollo program look unusual and are quite literally foreign to us in all other contexts. Flags waving in the airless environment of the moon, crosshairs seeming to disappear in photographs, no flames coming out of rocket engines. What is going on here? Are there actual explanations for all of these things, or are we just expected to take NASA's word? How do we actually know humans have been to the moon? I'm Tim Dodd, the Everyday Astronaut, and today we're going to go through some of the biggest questions about the Apollo program. We'll do some practical demonstrations and also find original sources for many events in question. We'll look into things like, why are there no stars in the sky? How did astronauts actually survive the Van Allen radiation belts? We'll talk about a few examples of things that couldn't possibly be replicated here on Earth, and we'll even break down the math for the entire mission so you yourself can double check if all the stuff actually adds up. And lastly, we'll dive into perhaps the most perplexing question. Why haven't humans gone back in over 50 years, considering that the phone in my pocket is more powerful than every computer in the entire Apollo program combined? So how do we actually know that NASA took humans to the moon for the Apollo program? Let's find out. We've never really addressed conspiracy theories on the Everyday Astronaut channel before because it often feels fairly pointless, like we'd either be preaching to the choir or feeding the trolls. That being said, there are honestly some decent and common questions about the Apollo program's moon landings that I figured we should check out ourselves. Because the answers and the stories and the context and physics behind a lot of these questions is honestly a lot more interesting than any conspiracy theory. Okay, now a quick little side note here before we get started. For good practice, no matter what image or video we use to examine any question, we will always find the original source scan of the image so we know its quality is tip-top and hasn't been altered or degraded from early scans or analog duplications. The best source for the full, raw, top-quality still images comes from Arizona State University, who took the entire archive of every single one of the 35,385 images shot during the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo program, and then they digitized them. These are huge files, and the medium format film shots are spectacular. Now for video, it actually gets a little bit harder, but we'll also try to find as close to source scans of footage as we can. However, some of it still hasn't been digitized in a modern low compression format, so we'll have to use the best quality we can find from NASA archives. And one thing to keep in mind while watching this video that some people might not always realize is just how many hours and hours of footage there is from the Apollo program. I think the average person is familiar with Apollo 11, and I guess in the context of thinking that NASA faked the moon landing, they might imagine it easy to fake a quick little clip of an astronaut on the moon. Well, first off, they don't maybe realize that even the Apollo 11 EVA was 3 hours continuous video. But some people don't even realize that there were 6 missions of increasing duration and scientific significance. In fact, Apollo 17 spent 3 full days on the moon. I told my friend that the other day. He had no idea. He was shocked. He had no idea that we spent so much time on the moon. That's why there's over 11,000 hours of footage and audio captured during the Apollo program. So there's a ridiculous amount of content out there, and I highly doubt the average person has seen all of it in its entirety. Okay, since this is a monster long video, here's the timestamps of all the different topics we talk about. The timeline is also broken up into these sections so you can easily jump to a specific topic. This video is intended to leave you with all of the tools, the knowledge, and the information necessary to continue learning on your own and to understand and appreciate how we know humans have walked on the moon. So I just kind of went all in on this one video, so hopefully can answer you or your friends or your family's biggest questions about the Apollo program. All right, buckle up, put on your favorite rocket t-shirt, grab a notebook and some popcorn. This is honestly such a fun topic with some incredible stories. So let's kick this thing off with a full-blown banger. Perhaps one of the most confusing video clips of the entire Apollo program. Of all the things that at first glance seem inexplicable and almost toy model-like, it's certainly this shot. Why does there appear to be a rainbow-looking explosion? Why were there no flames once the ascent stage lifted off from the moon? And maybe perhaps most importantly, who actually filmed this and how could they have tracked the ascent perfectly if it was remote controlled from Earth with a 1.3 second delay? Let's start off with some facts about this exact shot. This was the last image of humans on the moon to date. It was the takeoff of Apollo 17's lunar ascent module carrying astronauts Gene Cernan and Harrison Jack Schmitt on December 14th, 1972. What you're seeing is the ascent stage separating from the descent stage, which was left behind on the moon for all 6 of the Apollo missions that landed successfully on the moon. And yes, those descent stages are still on the moon today. Okay, let's start off with who or what took this video. This video was taken by the Ground Commanded Television Assembly. As the name implies, it was ground commanded, meaning it was controlled back in mission control in Houston. This allowed ground controllers to pan, tilt, and zoom the camera while the astronauts were doing tasks. This allowed mission control to stay even better connected than on previous missions. This camera was originally stowed and mounted in the modularized equipment stowage assembly, replacing the much lower quality black and white Westinghouse Apollo lunar television camera that captured the first steps on the moon during Apollo 11. And yes, the modularized equipment stowage assembly was deployed once they landed. The astronauts could pull a pin and the whole compartment would flop out, revealing tools and the TV camera that would be used on the surface of the moon. And this is actually how they broadcasted Neil Armstrong's first steps. But back to Apollo 17. The Ground Commanded Television Assembly color camera was then detached from the lunar module and mounted on the lunar rover vehicle, which had its own high-gain antenna, which helped it broadcast live color video from the moon. And quick little side note about that amazing little lunar rover vehicle, you know, the car that they drove on the moon. Do you know how they actually got this entire car onto the surface of the moon, considering that the lunar lander doesn't even seem to have any space to carry it at all? Well, for Apollo 15, 16, and 17, which were considered Apollo J missions, they utilized an enhanced lunar module, which was capable of carrying more weight to the surface of the moon. The lunar rover vehicle cleverly folded up and tucked up against an equipment bay on the descent stage. It was then unfolded on the moon, and it enabled for much greater distances to be covered during exploration of the lunar surface. Very cool. Okay, so how did NASA manage to capture liftoff? Well, unlike what some conspiracy theorists think, NASA didn't actually manage to capture liftoff successfully on the first try. It took 3 tries to get this shot. The first attempt was on Apollo 15, but unfortunately its tilt mechanism stopped working, so they were left with a stationary video of liftoff. It's still a pretty cool shot though. On Apollo 16, they tried to capture liftoff, but they didn't quite get the timing down correctly, and they slightly misjudged the distance the rover would need to be from the lunar lander in order to match its rate of climb. And this is because the pan and tilt only had one speed. It was either not moving or fully moving in a certain direction. There was no slower or faster options, it was just all or nothing. So to make sure its tilt speed matched the speed of the ascent module, they just needed to do a little math to know how far away to park the lunar rover vehicle, so the controller on the ground just needed to begin tilting at the right moment. And the liftoff from the moon was a pre-calculated time. So all the controller had to do was begin their movement, which included a zoom out, when they reached about T-2 seconds. And then the corresponding shot looked pretty dang impressive. Now it took 3 tries, but they got it. Now, something to keep in mind throughout this video in general, and especially in this particular section, is to know that there were several different types of cameras used on the Apollo missions. And depending on which camera was used and in which mode it was used in, the footage might look quite different. For stills, they mostly used that iconic Hasselblad 70mm camera. But there was also this wacky 35mm stereo lunar surface camera that would take stereoscopic images of lunar regolith. There's also a Maurer 16mm film camera that was used for some stills, but mostly time lapses and real-time videography. A lot of the higher quality video that you see from the surface of the moon comes from this camera, since it's film and it's not broadcast video. A lot of the footage shot in this camera might appear sped up. That's because it was shot at, say, 1 frame per second and played back in real time. But that's a good way to conserve film and still capture an entire mission's worth of EVAs. But for broadcast video, there are a few different cameras as well. Apollo 11 used the Westinghouse Apollo Lunar Television Camera. Apollo 12 through 14 used the Westinghouse Lunar Color Camera, and Apollo 15 through 17 used the RCA J-Series GCTA, or the Ground Commanded Television Assembly, that we've already been talking about. One of the coolest things about the Apollo missions is how they managed to squeeze color broadcasts on a very limited bandwidth. And the clever engineering that led to live color TV broadcasts on the moon is what caused that unique rainbow explosion thing at liftoff. Typical NTSC color TV required about 6 megahertz of bandwidth. For home TVs back in the day, it meant a huge omnidirectional TV tower and then smaller receiving antennas on the homes, or even those rabbit ears on TVs. On the command module, the high gain antenna, or the S-band antenna, had to limit its video bandwidth to only 2 megahertz. The command module's antenna was still actually fairly large. It was quad antennas that were steerable and had 2 amplifiers, which is not a luxury that the lunar lander could afford due to extreme weight limitations. So the lunar lander's smaller high gain, or S-band antenna, had only 700 kilohertz of bandwidth available for video broadcast. But on Apollo 12, the astronauts deployed a larger high gain antenna on the surface of the moon. These particular deployable dishes didn't have to articulate or move at all because the Earth doesn't move in the sky when standing on the surface of the moon. So it could be flimsy and lightweight, unlike the high gain antenna on the lunar module that needed to precisely aim automatically with a motor during maneuvers, so it was fairly heavy, but it was sturdy. On Apollo 15, 16, and 17, the high gain antenna was mounted on the lunar rover instead of being deployed on a separate stand. This deployable antenna increased the bandwidth to match that of the command module at 2 megahertz. Enough bandwidth to squeeze color TV out if you're clever. Which raises the question, how did they manage to squeeze color TV out of 1/3 the bandwidth? Well, here's where some real genius comes in. They used a scheme called sequential color, which basically uses black and white bandwidth, but sends 1 frame at a time of a red frame, then a blue frame, then a green frame, at 30 frames per second. There was a simple color wheel that just rotated to match the frame rate. But what this means is that you effectively only get a full color frame at 10 frames per second. And if a subject moves too quickly, it becomes very obvious. You can easily see each frame having a different color than the previous and next frames. And there sure were a lot of things moving quickly when the Ascent module fired up. And when we actually break it down even more, there's a ton of stuff happening during ignition of the Ascent stage. Right when the engine is commanded to ignite, 4 explosive bolts simultaneously sever the mechanical connection between the ascent and the descent stage. And both the bolt and the nut had explosive charges, so it only required one of those 2 working in order to have a clean separation. So the separation explosions, the umbilical and the insulating foil being thrown around by the Ascent engine exhaust, explains why we see this weird rainbow thing at liftoff. And while we're talking about exhaust from the engine, where is it? This is kind of awkward. Did NASA honestly forget to just add some exhaust and flames? Because it sure doesn't look like the engine is running at all. Well, for this, let's just look into the engine. And just talking about this engine gives me goosebumps because of one simple fact. it couldn't be test fired before the mission at all. Wait, what? Yeah, you heard me right. The one and only engine that would be the one and only thing that was capable of getting the astronauts off the surface of the moon couldn't actually be test fired prior to the mission, and the first time it was ever fired is when it was on the surface of the moon to leave the moon. So if that engine didn't work, the astronauts were stuck and they would die on the surface of the moon. Now, of course, there were identically built units fired on Earth to make sure the system was reliable, but because the engine used an ablatively cooled chamber and nozzle, once it was fired, it was toast. However, this engine was about as simple of a liquid-fueled engine as you can make. It's pressure-fed, meaning there are no pumps. You just open a valve and let the propellant flow. And importantly, there's no spark required to start ignition since it used hypergolic propellants that spontaneously combust upon contact with each other. Okay, now real quick, I did just talk about rocket engine cooling, how to power a rocket engine, and how to start a rocket engine, and I glossed over it in about 2 paragraphs. But if you want to learn more about the stuff and learn it in pretty great detail, I've got you covered with how to start a rocket engine, why don't rocket engines melt, and how to power a rocket engine. It's about 2.5 hours of content, but I promise you'll understand it all quite a bit by the end. Okay, starting and cooling and powering a rocket engine, it's all fun, it's all great stuff, but surely a liquid-fueled rocket engine is going to produce smoke and flames, right? Well, for this, all we have to do is watch basically any rocket launch that has visible exhaust, such as this Atlas V launch. Notice how when the rocket is in the atmosphere, the exhaust has a bright orange flame, but as it ascends, you'll notice 2 things. First, the exhaust grows bigger because the ambient air pressure is becoming lower and lower as the atmosphere gets thinner and thinner as it ascends. So the exhaust gas has less and eventually effectively no air pushing in against the exhaust as it exits the nozzles. So the exhaust actually expands out in all directions, which is an inherent inefficiency of all rocket engines in space. Now, the second thing you might notice is the flame goes from a bright orange flame to mostly transparent with just a little bit of black spewing out. What's happening here? Well, the reason it glows bright while in the atmosphere is because of the carbon in this particular propellant's exhaust, which on the Atlas V is RP1 and liquid oxygen. RP1 is just highly refined kerosene, and therefore when it's burnt, it spews out hot carbon molecules. But the still hot carbon molecules glow bright orange when they react with oxygen in our atmosphere. It's the afterburning of the molecules that make for the visible exhaust. As the oxygen in the atmosphere decreases with altitude, the glow also decreases and it eventually ceases. In my opinion, this is super cool to see. Okay, but I just showed you a kerosene-based fuel. What about the specific hypergolic fuel that they used on this ascent engine? How can it appear to be almost completely invisible, especially with an ablative nozzle? Well, for this, we should check out a Titan II launch video. Beyond the awesome fact that this rocket did hot staging, where it fired its second stage engine while it was still attached to the first stage while it was running, you'll notice that once the destructive stage separation has occurred, you can see right through the exhaust. It appears to be pretty much completely transparent. And again, this engine runs on the exact same propellant as the Lunar Module Ascent engine, the hypergolic combination of dinitrogen tetroxide and unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine, and it has an ablatively cooled nozzle. And one thing to keep in mind about the Lunar Module Ascent engine is that it was about 3% the amount of thrust as the LR91 on the Titan II, and only about 0.3% the amount of thrust as the RD-180 on the Atlas V. And of course, more thrust means more exhaust. So if a much more powerful engine can have its exhaust be transparent, it's certainly no surprise that a much less powerful engine could also produce no visible exhaust. But the reason that the Ascent engine could be so low power is because it didn't need to produce much thrust to lift the nearly 5-ton Lunar Module Ascent stage, since the moon only has 1/6 the amount of gravity as Earth. So this one tiny engine and the 2,376 kilograms of propellant was enough to get the Ascent stage and the astronauts all the way into lunar orbit with just a single stage. It's one of the wonderful things about a low gravity environment. And later on in this video, we'll actually do the math on the rocket equation for not only the lunar lander and the ascent stage, but also the entire Saturn V rocket to confirm if the math actually checks out and if the vehicle was truly capable of doing this whole mission in the first place. So the engine produced no visible exhaust because there's no atmosphere on the moon, and specifically no oxygen for the carbon molecules to react with to make it glow. The small amount of exhaust coming out was more or less transparent. In fact, if you saw a visible orange exhaust flame, it would be a sign that it was faked, because you would not be able to replicate that on the moon with no atmosphere. I kind of love when movies and TV shows get this wrong. I mean, even really good movies and TV shows like HBO's From the Earth to the Moon got this wrong, where they showed a very obvious exhaust. It just kind of cracks me up. Another reason why you can't see the flame is because it was broad daylight on the moon. So despite the engine likely glowing quite a bit, it was far too dim compared to the sun, which is much, much brighter than the engine glow. And speaking of it being daylight on the moon, this does bring up another great question. Where are all the stars? Okay, let's do another one that I actually get asked about often, even during launch live streams. Why don't we see stars in pictures and videos? And again, even during modern stuff like photos and videos of launches and on the ISS and stuff like that. I mean, this is actually a great question, since we tend to associate a black sky with nighttime here on Earth. As a former professional photographer, I love answering this one because it's right in my wheelhouse. The answer is actually simple. It's daytime. Why would you see stars? Just because the sky's black doesn't mean the scene is dark, despite what we're used to here on Earth. As we know, on Earth, the sky looks blue when our atmosphere is illuminated by the sun, and when the sun is not hitting our atmosphere, aka night, it appears black, and the ambient light becomes low enough to see faint starlight once our eyes adjust, even though the atmosphere continues to exist, of course. So it's not the lack of an atmosphere that makes stars visible either. Even during the day, if you get higher up in the sky, the atmosphere gets thinner and eventually becomes virtually non-existent, and therefore the sky will get darker and eventually black. However, seeing a black sky doesn't automatically mean you'll see stars. The sun is by far the most dominant light source in our solar system. It's more than 10 billion times brighter to us than Sirius, the next brightest star in the sky. So the reason we often don't see stars in images taken from space is because there is still daylight exposure in these images, and the scene is being fully illuminated by the sun. The camera is exposed for direct sunlight illumination. And don't forget, the moon has a day and night cycle too. It cycles between day and night roughly every 14 days instead of every 12 hours like here on Earth. So when it's daytime on the moon, which all Apollo landing missions intentionally were, you need to set your camera's exposure accordingly. If your eyes or a camera is exposed to broad daylight, you have to adjust your settings so they're the right sensitivity to expose your scene correctly. With a camera, it means closing up the aperture, increasing your shutter speed, and shooting with a low ISO film or setting. And the opposite is true when you want to take photos of something that's dim, like stars at night. You open up your aperture, decrease your shutter speed, and increase your ISO. In our eyes, our pupils act like an aperture and get really small to let in less light when it's bright, and our pupils dilate a lot when it's dark in order to let more light in. Now, of course, you could change your settings to shoot stars in these photos on the moon, but then everything else would be blown out and completely white. So the thing that you traveled 400,000 kilometers to photograph and document is now just a blown out white blob. In fact, you can do this from home because we experienced this exact same thing here on Earth when trying to take a picture of the moon. Just try it yourself. Try taking a photo of the moon from Earth that's properly exposed so you can see all the details of the surface of the moon, and try to get the stars in the exact same shot in a single exposure. You basically have to pick and choose, either expose for the bright reflective surface of the moon and end up with a dark sky, or expose for the dim stars and end up with the blown out white blob for the moon. It's the exact same thing we're dealing with here, trying to take a picture of the moon and the stars in the same exposure, but we're just doing it from further away. And frankly, this is fairly obvious to anyone who's done any photography or videography. This doesn't mean that you can't take photos of stars in space though. I mean, obviously, nor that you can't see them with your own eyes. But I figure you shouldn't have to take my word for it. let's ask astronaut Don Pettit to explain why it's difficult to see stars in space.
Everyday astronaut, this is Mission Control Houston. Please call station for a voice check.
Station, this is Tim Dodd, the Everyday Astronaut. How do you hear me?
Tim, I hear you loud and clear.
Fantastic. Don Pettit, the legend himself. How are you doing?
I'm doing just fine, Tim, and it's a pleasure to be able to talk to you, not only from the space station, but from the cupola, which is the premier place to be if you want to take imagery of Earth and the surroundings.
I had a few questions, especially questions that a lot of people ask about photography in space and things, so I was hoping that maybe you could help me answer those questions. How does that sound?
I'm happy to answer any questions you want, particularly if it helps other people do better imagery.
Sounds fantastic. Well, let's start off. A lot of people ask, why don't we see stars? And even right now in the background, why don't people see stars in space?
It's really bright, and your eyes are dialed down. They're stopped down, and the stars are a lot dimmer than what the ambient lighting is. So even though the stars are there, you cannot perceive the stars with your eyes. If you had instruments you could measure, but the contrast between the bright and the dark is such that you can't see stars. It's completely different though after orbital nighttime, and then the stars come out in all their glory.
Oh yeah, by the way, yes, Don was literally in space on the International Space Station when I asked him that question for this video. Thanks, Don. Don is a phenomenal space photographer, and he also had a crewmate named Matthew Dominic, and those two are just amazing space photographers. They've taken some incredible photos and videos, many of them with long exposure photography, time lapses, and some really cool day to nighttime exposures in space, and it's just simply amazing. You should definitely check out their work. Okay, anyway, back to how stars relate to the Apollo program. Even the Apollo astronauts could navigate using stars to double check their relative position in space using sextants and the flight computer as a backup. So stars are definitely visible in space, but like many things, there are variables that often prevent us from seeing them in photos. Okay, how about another photography question while we're at it? Why do shadows appear to almost intersect in many of the photographs from the moon? What seems like inconsistent shadows is a common thing for people to point to as suspect of a hoax. For this, let's take a look at this photograph that some people question, saying it was shot in a studio and is proof the Apollo landings were fake. It's from Apollo 17, magazine 136, frame 20,744, shot on one of the iconic Hasselblad 500 EL 6x6 medium format cameras with a Zeiss 60mm f5.6 lens by astronaut Harrison Jack Schmidt at mission elapsed time of 122 hours, 32 minutes and 50 seconds in the Taurus Littrow Valley. The claim here is that the shadows appear to be coming together, proving there to be multiple sources of light, or perhaps a light that's far too close. Certainly not the sun, that's millions of kilometers away. This is one of the easiest things to demonstrate on your own. All we have to do is go out when the sun is fairly low in the sky, about 15 degrees above the horizon, to match the lighting conditions in the photo. Then we need a lens that would be 35mm on a full frame camera, or a 35mm equivalent lens, since the 60mm lens on a medium format camera is equal to about 38mm. So to get the same perspective and angle of view, we'll want to aim for, 35mm or 40mm equivalent. Then we just need our camera to be placed roughly mid-chest to match where the Hasselblads were mounted on the A7LB spacesuits. It's pretty obvious that all shadows appear to point inwards towards the center of the photo. The further left or right an object is, the more this is exaggerated. And honestly, this is perhaps one of the most elementary of all things. They appear this way because of perspective, the exact same way parallel train tracks or roads appear to converge. And to prove these shadows are indeed parallel, Let's just fly up and look down to confirm that they're indeed straight and parallel. Now, ironically, conspiracy theorists claim something exactly backwards. They say shadows appear to converge because it's a close studio spotlight that is roughly 10 feet behind the subject. But the closer a light source is to the camera, the more the shadows appear to line up with the camera's field of view. So the shadows actually become less and less visible to the vantage point of the camera the closer the light source is. Again, this is kind of photography 101 stuff here. Now, it's often claimed that there are multiple sources of light, and that's why the shadows appear to be in different directions. But the reality is that multiple sources of light will produce multiple shadows on a single subject. And actually, the lighting on the surface of the moon would be virtually impossible to replicate in a studio, even with limitless funds and the most advanced solutions in the world, because notice that in all the images, the entire surface of the moon is equally lit. Since we don't see multiple shadows, you couldn't use multiple sources of light to try and evenly light the scenes, let alone mountains that are several kilometers away from the camera. And light follows the inverse square law. If you move an object twice as far away from a light source, it'll receive 1/4 the amount of light. So imagine trying to light a scene where everything is evenly lit and you don't see multiple shadows. Your light source would have to be several kilometers away, maybe hundreds or millions of kilometers away, and it would have to be unbelievably bright, or perhaps, it could just be the sun. And while we're talking about shadows, should we just touch on this image real quick? This is a photo that Neil Armstrong took of Buzz Aldrin coming down the ladder. If this wasn't shot in a studio, then how in the heck is he so well illuminated in the shadow of the LEM? This one is, again, pretty simple. I mean, obviously the surface of the moon reflects sunlight, which is why it's so bright in our sky and why it can even illuminate the ground here on Earth under a full moon at night. This means the entire ground acts like a giant bounceville. Now, in photography, we have these bounce boards or reflectors that do the exact same thing. They provide a fill light, and you can see them used here all the time with most professional photographers, especially in portrait work. And it's the exact same situation on the moon. In fact, we see the same thing here on Earth quite often, like in this image of a lifeguard shack on a beach in Pensacola, Florida, where it shows the beach reflecting as a bounce fill almost exactly like the lunar surface. If we take a peek at the metadata for this image, we can see it was taken with a Nikon D200 at f13, ISO 250, and 1/640th of a second for the shutter speed. So it's pretty clearly daylight settings. Notice that the reflective surface of the beach does the exact same thing to the lifeguard shack as the reflective surface of the moon does to the lunar lander. Side note, how awesome are these lifeguard shacks? They're all over Pensacola Beach, and they almost look like little lunar landers. These are just perfect. And here's another fun example. This one's from Apollo 17. Notice that when astronaut Gene Cernan was in the shadow of this massive split boulder, you can still fairly clearly see him. And this is despite the low dynamic range of the ground-commanded television camera. We can still clearly see a bounce fill from the reflective surface of the moon, helping to fill the shadowed area with some light. Okay, in case we haven't proven this point enough yet, in 2014, the company NVIDIA actually painstakingly digitally recreated the entire scene, down to the smallest little details and bolts and foils and everything, and then did a ray tracing simulation to see if the results from this computer simulation would match the film. And guess what? The results were exactly what we see in the photo. In fact, it's almost impossible to tell which one's the render and which one's the real photo. That's how detailed it is, and their physics simulation recreated it perfectly. Okay, this conspiracy theory has a pretty straightforward explanation, and it's honestly pretty basic photography stuff. But there is one more photography thing that is really strange. Why do some of these crosshairs appear to go behind the astronauts and other objects? Is this proof that at least maybe a few of these photos were doctored? Of all the questions that come up from the Apollo program, the fact that there are images where the crosshairs appear to be behind objects and even behind astronauts is maybe some of the most confusing things, but it's actually, believe it or not, one of the simplest things. First off, the crosshairs in question are known as fiduciary markers, and they're actually etched onto a glass plate called a Rizal plate. and this glass plate was inside of the Hasselblad cameras, and it's pressed up against the film. So it's in between the film and the lens, so these crosshairs appear on every single image taken with these Hasselblad cameras. The markers are in a 5x5 grid, and they're tiny, only 1 millimeter long and 0.02 millimeters wide. The crosshairs are helpful in spotting warping of images, especially in the analog duplication process of developing and printing. The crosshairs can also be used as a bit of a reference to kind of help determine some scale and distances in images when cross-referenced with objects of known size in the image. So this is fairly simple and straightforward. Areas of high contrast with a lot of light tend to blow out bits of the fiduciary markers in the exposure of the film. This is very obvious in many images taken on the moon. However, all we really have to do is compare the high quality scans to the older low quality scans, and we can pretty easily see some of the fine details in the crosshairs that just simply get lost in the low quality scans. This especially compounds if the original scan has been reduplicated via analog processes, which many of the older images that you might see on the internet have. And again, this is where it's important to visit the highest quality source image. So the reality is, a lot of images we see are older, lower quality scans that have been in circulation for a long time, and unfortunately, due to their lower quality, some of the details are just simply lost, such as those very fine fiduciary markers when they're shot against a bright background where it can be blown out in exposure. Okay, let's move out of photography land and get into some stranger phenomena, like the flag. Why was the flag waving in the vacuum of space? I remember seeing a video when I was young of the American flag appearing to wave in the airless surface of the moon. I remember thinking something was extremely fishy. Why is it moving? There's no air on the moon, so why is it appearing to wave in the wind? Now this one's been talked about a lot, and most of you probably already know what's going on here, but in case you don't, it's actually really cool. In order to make it so the flag was fully extended, NASA devised a way to prop the flag up so you could see the entire face of it. Otherwise, it would have simply sagged and been a mostly crumpled up flag and wouldn't have made for very inspiring images. Believe it or not, there's actually a few important considerations for designing something as seemingly simple as a flagpole. The primary constraint is, of course, mass. The fully deployed flag assembly was only 4.2 kilograms and could stow up to take up very little space on the lunar lander. Another big consideration was how much force an astronaut could exert inside a pressurized spacesuit, considering there was a lot of rigidity inside their suits when they're pressurized that limited their range of motion and made hand movements quite difficult. What NASA engineers came up with was a simple anodized aluminum telescoping pole with an extendable crossbar to fully deploy at 90 degrees to the main pole. Fun fact, do you know where the flag was stowed? It was actually attached to the left side of the ladder inside a little shield to prevent it from getting pelted by lunar debris and extreme heating during the landing. Okay, none of this answers the question of why does the flag appear to wave in wind? Well, I think we're actually asking the wrong question. The real question should be, why would it stop moving at all in the vacuum of space? Since there's no atmosphere on the moon to slow something down with air resistance, if a piece of cloth was swinging, wouldn't it actually continue to swing forever? Well, yes, assuming there was no friction in the system. So that's exactly what's happening here. During the deployment, the flag is of course moved about and tossed because the astronauts are trying to shove it into the ground. And if it has any inertia, any movement going at all, it will continue to sway back and forth since there is no air resistance to slow it down. The only thing that will slow the flag down and prevent it from penduluming back and forth forever is the tiny bit of friction against the pole and the fabric, and an even smaller amount of internal friction in the fibers of the flag against each other while in motion. And just like waves in a body of water, the flag can have different resonant waves and different frequencies that can stack up and make for large motions. And now this is mostly due to the 3 feet attachments on one side and the 5 foot attachment on the top. The waves ripple through the flag, and when they line up, they can make for some strange jumps in motion. This is quite apparent in a few videos of flag deployment. If you watch any deployment footage for long enough, you'll see the flag always comes to a rest. Even if it's been shaken about for a good amount, it'll settle within a short period of time. This is something that the Mythbusters actually demonstrated at scale with a large vacuum chamber. They first waved a flag at 1 atmosphere, or 14.7 psi, And then they did the same thing in a vacuum. They proved you don't need wind to make a flag wave. In fact, air makes a flag stop waving quicker than when there's no air present. This is another one of those things where I understand why it looks unusual and how it can raise questions. But the answer to why it continues to wave is actually a lot more interesting to me because of the foreign environment of the moon. But another thing that looks even more unusual and more confusing is how the astronauts move on the moon. Why do they look like they're literally suspended by cables and tip over in such unusual ways, only to right themselves very unusually? Why is the movement of the astronauts walking on the moon so strange? Why does it almost look like they're on wires, tripping up in strange ways, and generally looking incredibly clumsy? Well, similar to why the liftoff of Apollo 17's lunar module looks weird, or why the flag movement is strange, the airless and low-gravity environment of the moon is simply foreign to us humans. Most of us will spend 100% of our lives living in and observing a 1G environment. When we play catch with a ball, we can predict where that ball will go, and we can pre-plan its trajectory based on prior experiences. We've evolved to excel in our terrestrial environment. What this means in practice is that we're used to the correlation between inertia and weight. Now notice that I said weight and not mass. Mass and inertia are always completely linked, but the weight of an object depends on the local gravity. What's that mean? Well, imagine you're sprinting on Earth, and imagine what it takes to turn a corner on a track. You can picture pushing your feet into the ground, leaning over, and turning. If you were doing the same thing on the moon, and you were sprinting again at that same speed, which would be terrifying on the moon, and you tried to lean over to turn, your body would have the same momentum as it does on Earth because your mass is the same. But the local gravity is only pulling you down with 1/6 the amount of pull. This means your momentum really wants to keep you going straight. And this could get you in trouble in a hurry, considering the low traction and dangerous aspects of lunar regolith. This is also true when you just try and walk normally on the moon. In order to move forward, we lean forward a little bit, and then we basically catch ourselves. So what happens when that pull down is only 1/6 the amount? Well, you have to lean further to do the same amount of work. This means you have to get your center of gravity way out beyond your toes. Now, this might be okay in a controlled environment, but when you're in a stiff, bulky, pressurized spacesuit with limited mobility, this becomes even more difficult to control and handle. And you'll see this happen in clips when astronauts get a little too much momentum. All of a sudden, they can get their feet way out from underneath them, and this whole thing can just spiral out of control until they wind up comically falling. While this might look silly, it's actually quite dangerous since there's always the risk of tearing your spacesuit, which would cause a leak and potentially killing you on the surface of the moon. And of course, when they do fall over and they try to get up, it looks really weird. And that's because they're in 1/6 gravity. So you'll notice they kind of do like a push-up motion most of the time to kind of try to pop back up onto their feet. And it might take them a few tries because they don't want to push too hard. It's only 1/6 gravity, so they could easily accidentally flip themselves back over onto their back, and they could be stuck there like turtling on their back. So they kind of have to do this, a few pumps maybe to get back up and try to keep their feet under their center of gravity. It looks ridiculous because it is ridiculous, and it's such a foreign concept to us here on Earth. I actually asked Apollo 16 astronaut Charlie Duke about this.
We decided that before we were to get back in the last time, there's not bad emotion if you don't panic. And so roll right, and I rolled to the right and broke my fall and on my back, and man, my heart was pounding like that, but I realized I'm still alive. So John comes over and looks down and says, "That wasn't very smart, Charlie."
This is why the astronauts quickly adopted the bunny hop that we so often see. This keeps their feet below them, and it keeps them from relying on their life's learned reflexes on how to walk normally. But we can also demonstrate this concept another way, using a rocket simulator, or in my case, I'll use my favorite rocket simulator, Kerbal Space Program. If we build a little rocket to hover and then translate over to reach, let's say, 30 meters per second, and then hover again and land, we will notice a stark difference between an Earth gravity environment and a lunar gravity environment. Notice that on Earth, the rocket barely needs to lean over to pick up horizontal velocity, but to do that on the moon, it has to lean over a lot more. That's because if we have all things equal, the same mass of the little lander and the same engine, we basically have to throttle the engine down in order to hover on the moon. So in order to produce the same amount of horizontal acceleration, it needs to lean over substantially more to produce the same result. There's also the idea that the moon landing footage is just half-speed footage shot on Earth, since they appear to move slower and stay bouncing in the air longer than on Earth. Well, that's easy enough. Let's just double the speed of the footage of the astronauts walking on the moon. Yeah, that still looks very not like how humans move on Earth. Try and replicate these movements on your own. You can't. And I don't really think you could develop any kind of rig to accomplish these results that weren't blatantly obvious, because NASA did actually do some training with a system called the Partial Gravity System, or POGO, that could help people feel a simulated 1/6 gravity. But it wouldn't work for even a second of video claiming to be of someone walking on the moon. This is mostly because it works by having someone on their side, and the ground that they walk on is slightly off from a 90-degree angle, which helps produce a pretty accurate 1/6 gravity environment, but it can only do so on one axis. NASA would also use rigs to offset about 80% of Earth's gravity with counterweights to help prepare and test things like egress and ingress of the lunar lander. But it's just so obvious that the astronauts are either suspended or sideways, and you just can't hide that in video, especially with technology of the time. But forget about freedom of motion. You certainly can't hide the rigging and the obvious clues that someone's hanging sideways. So it's not an option for faking lunar gravity convincingly in video. Now there is a new modern rig that NASA has called Argos that is basically a robotic system that offsets your weight and also follows your motion precisely to cancel any resistance that you'd normally feel in moving the tether system around. It's amazing and it's actually really advanced, but again, even if the technology existed back then, it would be impossible to hide it using techniques of the time. And hold on. As far as a conspiracy theory goes, if this was all pre-shot and pre-planned, you'd sure think if they were on wires, they just leave out the parts where they fell over and gave that effect away. But the reality is, this is just simply what it looks like to walk and fall on the moon. But there's one more thing we can do to verify if the physics actually match lunar gravity. We can track the movement when the astronauts jump and actually see if it's correct. We can use this free tool from physics.org, simply called Tracker. This video is of John Young from Apollo 16. Let's set our scale to be approximately 1.9 meters long, since John was about 1.71 meters tall, but wearing the spacesuit and the boots and the helmet, he's right about 1.9 meters tall. We'll choose a moment where he's fully extended, so we have a good, clean, unobstructed view of his top and the bottom of him, and we know he's not slouching, so we can set our scale here. Then let's track the top edge of his life support backpack, since it's an area of high contrast and is easy to track precisely. If we plot out the motion and analyze it to a parabola, we'll see it comes out to be about minus 8.045 E minus 1, which if we first remove the scientific notation of E minus 1, it gets us to minus 0.8045, and our beautiful y-axis parabola is half of g. So if we multiply that by 2, we get an acceleration of 1.61 meters per second squared, which lo and behold is spot on to the 1.62 meters per second squared of lunar gravity. Now, of course, this could be more accurate if we had, higher resolution video, higher frame rate, and we knew the exact height of John Young. But yeah, it's pretty much dead on, exactly as you'd expect. And let's take a quick look at what Hollywood has achieved when trying to replicate walking on the moon. Every clip from every movie or show or music video that I've ever seen using the most advanced techniques and most cutting edge technology, including modern CGI, still can't quite match the look of the films shot on the moon. Okay, so speaking of walking around on the moon, why is it that these famous pictures of the footprints on the moon don't match the bottoms of the feet of the spacesuits worn by the astronauts? What gives? Why do the footprints on the surface of the moon not appear to match the bottoms of the suits that were brought back from the moon? I remember seeing this picture and kind of going, wait, what? Several years ago. It only took me about 30 seconds to Google it and realize that there were separate booties worn on the moon to protect the spacesuits from punctures and to also provide extra traction as well. That's really all there is for this one. There's boots that go on top of the footies from the A7L spacesuits. Why does this rock appear to have the letter C on it? Is this proof that this is simply a studio's prop rock labeled with a giant C for the props department? This image is AS16-107-17446, taken by Charlie Duke at Stone Mountain. Well, let's start off by asking a few questions. Why would prop rocks have huge labels on them in the first place? How would a props manager miss that? How would the photographer miss that? How would NASA miss that when scanning and publishing the images? How would a letter C on a bumpy rock surface even look so perfect in the first place? Wouldn't it need to follow the contour of the rock? Yes. Yes, it would need to do that. And why limit yourself to 26 letters on a scene with hundreds of rocks when numbers would be much better for that job? This one is cut and dry. Let's look for the source image. Here we go. A higher quality source image has no such C. And importantly, if we look at another image of the exact same rock, we also see that no letter C is visible there either. What it wound up being is a very small hair on one of the earlier low quality scans. In fact, you can even see the shadow the hair is casting on the older scan. This one's done. Next. Did a Dutch National Museum really have a moon rock from NASA on display that turned out to just be petrified wood? Well, part of that story is true and part of it's not, and quite frankly, this story is hilarious. So the Rijksmuseum Amsterdam, which is an incredible art museum right in the heart of Amsterdam, was gifted a rock that was supposedly a moon rock following the death of former Prime Minister Willem Drees in 1988. Drees supposedly received the rock as a private gift on October 9th, 1969, less than 3 months after the Apollo 11 mission landed, while the astronauts were on their giant leap tour around the world, celebrating the achievements. Well, there's some problems with this whole story. First off, this is what the actual sample given to the Netherlands by NASA looked like. The small chunks of moon rock are encapsulated in plastic. They're not just hanging out in someone's pocket, and it's certainly not nearly as big as this supposed moon rock, which was about 55 millimeters by 20 millimeters. Real samples were small fragments, not entire stones, due to their extreme rarity, considering that NASA only recovered a total of 382 kilograms of rock throughout all 6 missions that landed. Second, all samples were given to current government officials, and there's no reason they would have possibly given a moon sample to Drees, who had been out of office for 11 years in 1969. Lastly, the note that was thought to be from NASA that was attached or presented with the rock was inconsistent with NASA language and notation, including the use of the British spelling of center, R-E, instead of center, E-R, and they put a hyphen in between Apollo and 11. Not to mention, it looks absolutely nothing like a moon rock. So the reality is, someone somewhere either got confused, or a few people got confused, or a prankster somewhere is laughing that they got a museum to display petrified wood as a moon rock. Now, if this was a sample that was actually given to the museum by NASA and was presented like all the other samples given to other countries, and then it turned out to be petrified wood, yeah, that would be very strange and look very bad for NASA, but that's far from the case. Okay, that's enough fun. Now it's time for maybe one of the biggest questions. How do astronauts even get to the moon in the first place? How do they get through the deadly Van Allen radiation belts? Everything we've talked about so far makes a pretty big assumption here, that humans even made it to the moon in the first place. But one of the biggest questions remains. How did astronauts survive going through the Van Allen radiation belts? To best understand how the astronauts and their film survived the Van Allen belts, we'd better learn what exactly they are and how they work. The Van Allen belts are areas of energetic charged particles trapped in kind of a toroidal donut-shaped belt that surrounds the Earth. The particles mostly originate from solar wind and are trapped by Earth's magnetosphere. The Van Allen radiation belts were confirmed by the Explorer 1 and Explorer 3 satellites, and they were mapped out by Explorer 4, Pioneer 3, and Luna 1. They were confirmed by James Van Allen from right here in Iowa at the University of Iowa. Statements like humans can't survive the Van Allen radiation belts and NASA didn't even use any lead shielding also makes a lot of assumptions and misses some very important facts and context. It'd kind of be like saying humans can't survive in Antarctica because it's too cold. Well, I mean, sure, but not really. It all depends on what clothes they're wearing. How long are they there in Antarctica? What resources do they have? How long are they exposed to extreme weather? Et cetera, et cetera. The details and context and variables, they matter a lot. There's a few simple facts that some people seem to miss when making claims that humans can't survive the Van Allen belts. The first fact is lead would actually be a terrible choice for radiation shielding because of the exact type of radiation in the Van Allen belts. NASA engineered lightweight shielding that helped protect the astronauts from this specific radiation environment. Number 2, you can fly around the belts and avoid the most dangerous portions of radiation. The flight path can reduce the amount of time spent passing through the worst portions of the belts. And number 3, radiation is cumulative. So while the intensity of radiation matters, time spent in radiation is the other part of the equation. If you're simply passing through radiation for a few minutes, it's different than lingering there for hours or days. Let's dive into these a little bit more, starting off with shielding. Why wasn't there lead shielding on the Apollo spacecraft to protect against the radiation? Well, for this, we need to know what type of radiation we're dealing with in the Van Allen belts. The Van Allen belts are mostly made up of highly charged particles from the sun. And the sun is mostly emitting alpha particles, beta particles, and protons. Alpha particles are actually quite big, and therefore they won't penetrate most objects, including our skin. In fact, cardboard would be a valid choice of shielding against alpha particles. Literally. Protons can penetrate thicker, and therefore you'd want some metal or even plastic to shield against it. The outer aluminum shell of the Apollo spacecraft was thick enough to shield against protons. But beta particles are tiny, and they can easily penetrate many things. However, they're so small they typically don't cause much damage when they do hit things. But here's where this whole thing gets interesting. The worst thing you'd want to use to protect yourself against beta particles is heavy metal. Because when a beta particle hits a heavy atom, such as lead, it can cause re-radiation in the form of X-rays. And this is actually how X-ray machines work. You shoot electrons at an anode and it'll produce X-rays, which is definitely something we want to avoid because they are harmful and can damage cells. The best materials to shield against beta particles are lightweight atoms such as hydrogen. So you want something with a lot of hydrogen, like water, or even plastics like high-density polyethylene. Lead is a great and cheap choice to protect against X-rays and gamma rays, which are mostly produced by nuclear reactions. But because it's heavy and can be re-radiated by beta particles, it's a horrible choice for radiation shielding on a spacecraft. If we look at what the command module hull was actually made of, we see it was made up of multiple layers, including aluminum and stainless steel. This helped reduce the amount of exposure the astronauts experienced in the belts and once beyond them too. And that brings us to our next point. The belts are a gradient of intensity and toroidal in shape. This means it's possible to avoid the spots of highest radiation by simply flying around them on your path to the moon. And this is exactly what most of the Apollo missions did. Now, this is going to get into a bit of orbital mechanics, but bear with me here. I'll first say exactly how, and then I'll explain a little bit more in depth. The Apollo missions flew around the most dense and energetic portions of the Van Allen belts by altering their trans-lunar injection points in correlation to the geomagnetic latitude. By altering their launch azimuth in the roll profile at liftoff, NASA could avoid flying through the densest parts of radiation. Okay, that was a lot of jargon. Let me break that down a bit. The moon doesn't orbit the Earth's equator, nor is it on the same orbit as the Earth's orbit around the sun. The moon is about 5 degrees off axis to the sun, and the Earth is tilted at about 23.5 degrees relative to our orbit around the sun. This means depending on where exactly the moon is at in its orbit compared to how it correlates with the tilt of the Earth, and depending on where exactly in the launch window the Saturn V took off at, it had to do a roll maneuver to align itself on a trajectory to the moon. Then, depending on if the moon was south of the celestial equator, the translunar injection, or TLI, was in the northern hemisphere, and if the moon was north of the celestial equator, the TLI was in the southern hemisphere. We also have to factor in that the orientation of the geomagnetic field isn't in perfect alignment with the equator and the poles, and we can figure out what is the best trajectory to avoid the worst parts of radiation. And don't forget, orbits are just ellipses, but they're ellipses in 3D space, so they can have different angles or inclinations, and we can make it so they can fly, more up and over the belts as much as possible. So let's take a look at the actual mission trajectories in correlation with the Van Allen belts. You'll notice that one of these missions flew smack through the middle of the densest parts of radiation. But wait, how did a crew survive exposure to the worst parts of the Van Allen belts? Well, remember that second thing that we talked about, time. The Apollo spacecraft is screaming through this region of space after its translunar injection. The velocity of the spacecraft is nearly 39,000 kilometers an hour after translunar injection. So despite the fact that it's slowing down all the way to the moon, the amount of time spent in the densest regions is only a few minutes since it's right after TLI. This means that the entire amount of time spent in the belts isn't that much more than a half hour, and what this ultimately means is we can correlate the flight paths to the radiation dose that the astronauts received according to the NASA publication, Biomedical Results of Apollo. As you might imagine, the Apollo 14 astronauts received the highest dosage of radiation at 1.14 rad for the entire Okay, so let's make up a worst case scenario here where it averages an hour at that peak radiation per pass. So once on your way to the moon and once coming back. So approximately 1 hour in a radiation environment that's 10,000 times stronger than here on Earth. So even with zero shielding and you're spending 1 full hour in peak radiation, your trip to the moon and back would only be a little bit worse than 1 year's worth of radiation here on Earth, since there's 8,760 hours in a year. And of course, humans can live to be, 80 or 90 or 100 years old. Let's say you live to be 100 years old, and 1 extra year of radiation exposure is only a 1% gain in your total radiation exposure throughout your lifetime. Yeah, that's basically nothing. And again, don't forget, that's the absolute worst case scenario, flying straight through the worst parts of the belts with zero mass between you and space, which would just never happen. So it'd certainly be much less than a year's worth of radiation, and that's just not that bad. But the Apollo astronauts aren't the only humans to fly to the Van Allen belts. In fact, in 2024, the Polaris Dawn crew flew to an altitude of over 1,400 kilometers, flying directly into the inner Van Allen belts. So I asked Polaris Dawn astronauts Sarah Gillis and Anna Menon about their experience flying in the Van Allen belts.
We did a lot of analysis, the team did a lot of analysis ahead of time to try to understand, what sort of environment are we putting these humans into from a radiation perspective? Do they need to wear additional coverings on their bodies? And ultimately, it was determined that the dose that we would get of radiation was about equivalent in the course of the 5 days to about a 3-month stay on ISS. And so well within human limits, well within reason. And so we didn't end up needing additional protection. The vehicle offers a certain level of protection. And so we were okay there. And then there was a lot of monitoring radiation equipment on board that we're still waiting on the data from, but that'll give some really good post-flight analysis into what the actual experienced environment was.
Radiation in the Van Allen belts is just simply one of those things where some people might not have all the context for what's meant by saying it's deadly and how you can mitigate that. Speaking of context, there's actually a NASA video that a lot of people actually pointed to, claiming that NASA themselves admit that they've never taken humans through the Van Allen belts. And the video in question is called Orion Trial by Fire, and it's on the official NASA YouTube page. This was a promotional video released on December 3rd, 2014, just 2 days before the first orbital test flight of the new Orion spacecraft. And Orion is the crew capsule for the Artemis program. This video was made to help get the public excited about this first test flight of a brand new human-rated moon-capable spacecraft. It's the first one since the Apollo spacecraft. This mission was a unique one. Since the SLS rocket wasn't ready to fly the heavy Orion capsule, NASA went with the next most powerful and capable rocket at the time, which was the Delta IV Heavy rocket, to do the full shakedown of the Orion vehicle. This test flight included testing its separation systems, its avionics, its heat shield, the parachutes, and recovery operations. It was actually one of the first launches that I ever attended, and it was incredible. Anyway, this video has one line in particular that has made some conspiracy theorists raise their hand and say, "Gotcha." Here it is.
We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space.
Some additional context here. Because Orion was flying on a Delta IV Heavy, the rocket didn't have enough oomph to get the Orion spacecraft all the way to the moon, but one of the main objectives was to send Orion as high as possible so they could test the heat shield in as punishing of an environment as possible. But despite the Delta IV Heavy being the most powerful rocket available at the time, it could only loft Orion to an altitude of 5,800 kilometers, which means the vehicle would not only fly through the Van Allen belts, it would actually linger in high radiation portions of the belts much longer than a vehicle on a trans-lunar injection would. So NASA obviously had to test this entire system before humans could ever ride on this new vehicle. And that's exactly what EFT-1 was. It was a test of a new vehicle, Orion. And to summarize this whole thing, I actually think the best person to summarize it might be the man who said it himself in that NASA video, Kelly Smith.
So this particular mission was designed to set up a high-speed reentry test, and with the limitations of what the Delta IV Heavy was able to deliver, it forced us to spend a lot of time in the Van Allen belts. And so, yeah, there was some concerns about what this could do to instrumentation, but there's no concern about we would never put humans on a mission profile like this to just loiter in the Van Allen belts. There's no objective to doing that for a human class mission, and so you would pass through the Van Allen belts, or you'd kind of skim through a portion of it on the way to the moon, but you wouldn't spend nearly as much time as the particular profile for EFT-1 did.
So yeah, that honestly pretty much sums it up perfectly. Thanks, Kelly. Okay, but what about the heat of the Van Allen belts? Now, I've heard people claim that the belts are so hot that it would melt aluminum, and there's no way a spacecraft could survive that, let alone humans. And, well, in some ways, they're right. If you Google, how hot are the Van Allen belts, you'll probably see that ions in the plasma regions have been measured to be between 2,000 and 20,000 Kelvin. That's crazy hot, especially when you consider that the melting point of aluminum is around 930 Kelvin. Well, the first thing to remember is that the Van Allen belts are essentially in a vacuum. Despite being populated by a slightly denser amount of particles, it's still so sparse, it's a vacuum, so there's just almost nothing there at all. What that means is despite individual particles being able to have a lot of heat energy, especially ions and electrons, if they were in an atmosphere, they would actually quickly dissipate all of that heat into all of the surrounding air molecules. This also means that there's so few molecules that they won't transfer much heat into anything that they happen to wind up running into. It's just like how you can have scalding hot sparks coming off of a piece of metal that you're grinding up to 1400 Celsius in temperature, and they can hit your bare skin and you can be perfectly fine. So there's just not enough particles hitting your skin, and they tend to bounce off of you, so they're not touching your skin for very long. So not only will they tend to not melt your skin into goo like you'd think that something at 1400 Celsius would, but they usually don't even burn you. It all comes down to energy density. It's similar to how a 100 degrees Celsius gas would probably not burn your skin at all, as opposed to water at 100 degrees Celsius would certainly burn you. There's just much more heat capacity in a denser fluid, and the Van Allen belts are virtually in a pure vacuum. In fact, there's only about 100 ions in a cubic meter of the Van Allen belts. Think about that. Only 100 teeny tiny atomic sized particles in a space roughly half the size of a small shower. That's absolutely nothing. And besides that, let's not forget, there's literally hundreds and hundreds of satellites that have flown beyond the Van Allen belts that are made of aluminum or similar relatively low melting point materials. There's over 700 satellites that are beyond low Earth orbit, not to mention any interplanetary mission or lunar mission as well. And the United States isn't the only one operating spacecraft beyond the Van Allen belts. I mean, there's Russia, most of the countries in Europe, China, India, Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Egypt. I mean, the list goes on and on. They all operate spacecraft beyond the Van Allen belts. But despite the fact that getting through the Van Allen belts is quite reasonable, there's still people that think that NASA faked astronauts ever getting through them. And there's one video in particular that has been considered as the ultimate proof that humans didn't go to the moon. This is honestly a conspiracy that I don't think should exist at all. I mean, no offense to the man that Buzz Aldrin punched in the face, Bart Sibrel, but when I heard him explain how he thinks NASA faked footage of the Earth looking far away during the Apollo 11 mission, I was honestly puzzled. But I have had some people ask me to look into this particular video, so we better just look into it. Let's start off with the claim. In a video called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, Sibrel claims to have been accidentally given allegedly unreleased footage from NASA themselves. I mean, I guess that's interesting to say the least. In the footage, he believes it shows the Apollo 11 crew in low Earth orbit, but preparing and executing a shot where they're going to make it look like they're far away from Earth instead of just right there in Leo. He claims the astronauts obscured the Earth using a window of the Apollo spacecraft. He also believes there to be a studio light in the shot, which is confusing considering he believes the shot was done in low Earth orbit. Let's start off with his first claim that this footage was never released and was never meant to be released. Well, not only was it released, it aired almost immediately after being transmitted back down to Earth on television. The exact clips in question are Apollo 11 TV transmission 033-5945 GET and Apollo 11 unscheduled TV 031-1030 GET. The reason some were considered unscheduled TV transmission is because they weren't scheduled for live broadcast at that exact time. However, the footage was being transmitted and recorded to all news stations so they could use it in segments later on in the news. To claim it didn't go public and was never released publicly is simply a bold-faced lie. In fact, the easiest way to find this exact clip is to go to a little website called nasa.gov/history and read the Apollo 11 flight journal, where they have every audio and TV transmission throughout the entire mission in order. But long story short, these were very clearly publicly available. They aired publicly. There was nothing secret nor unreleased about them. So as strange as saying that they were unreleased secret tapes is, the next claim is maybe even more perplexing and throws any semblance of logic Sibrel had out the window. Literally. The claim is that the astronauts never left low Earth orbit, and the shots you see of Earth is just a small portion of the Earth being obscured by one of the Apollo command module windows to appear as though it's small and far away. First off, there weren't really any circular windows on the Apollo spacecraft. Now the hatch window was circular, but it had a squared off housing with straight edges that would have been visible from any angle if you tried to use the edges to make a circle for some reason. The claim also says they moved to the back of the spacecraft to make the window look smaller and therefore the planet smaller. Now, this is true, they did move to the back of the spacecraft and you hear them talk about that and you see it in the footage. But if you were to move up, down, left, or right at all, the parallax would actually give away this effect. And that's just a horrible way to try and make the Earth look small. If we want to know what it looks like when you try to use the window to obscure the shot, we can actually see this exact thing happening in this shot from unscheduled TV 031-1030 GET. But the reality is, this isn't even what Earth looks like from low Earth orbit anyway. This is what Earth looks like out the window of a spacecraft that's in low Earth orbit. If this were shot from Leo, the Earth would look very, very different. Not to mention, you wouldn't be able to see the Terminator line or the shadow of day and night like this from Leo at all. Now, here's an interesting thing that Sibrel got completely wrong. He claims that they zoom out and then that a studio light just turns on and you can see the inside of the spacecraft. And what he's missing is that that's not a studio light turning on. That's just simply the astronauts exposing the inside of the spacecraft, because that's what they said they're going to do for this broadcast, was show the outside, then show the inside and see the astronauts. And what you're actually seeing is one of the windows now being, illuminating the inside of the spacecraft. And that sun angle actually matches the sun angle of the Earth. It's actually really simple, and it lines up exactly with models and images of the inside of the spacecraft. I don't even really get how this is in any way a controversy. It's just not. It's someone using a video, adding some sinister music, taking things out of context, and literally making things up to fit a narrative. But speaking of NASA videos, one thing conspiracy theorists often point to as proof of a grand conspiracy is the fact that NASA lost the original tapes from Apollo 11. Is that true? Did NASA really lose the original Apollo 11 tapes? Yeah, they lost some of them. Is it true that this famous shot of Neil Armstrong taking his first steps on the moon were literally replications filming a screen and not the original source? Kind of, but it might not be quite what you think. First off, I've heard people say something along the lines of all Apollo footage was lost, and that's simply not true. Don't forget, there were 6 Apollo missions that landed on the moon, and only the source data's backups from Apollo 11 were lost. More on that in a second. Second, and perhaps most importantly and impressively, all physical films, both 70mm stills and the 16mm motion picture films that were shot during Apollo 11, and frankly, all of the Apollo missions were successfully brought back home, and they still exist today in their original form. There was over 500 meters of 16mm film that was shot on Apollo 11, all of which made it back safely and has not been lost. It's still housed today at Building 8 in Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. Now, I know that 500 meters of film sounds like a ridiculous amount of film to most of us today in a digital era, but that's actually less than 1 hour of footage at 24 frames per second, and film is actually remarkably light. 500 meters like that is less than 2 kilograms. Okay, anyway, I think when people hear NASA lost the original footage of Apollo 11, they think that there's no original footage of the mission at all. And that's simply not true. What was lost was the very original source backup data recordings of the TV transmission from the moon to the Earth. Remember when earlier we were talking about how it was a pretty big achievement to even get slow scan black and white live television from the moon, because the first lunar lander only had a high gain antenna capable of only 700 kilohertz, so they could save weight on the lunar lander? Well, one key thing is that in order to transmit any video back from the moon for the first mission, they had to use a lower resolution, slow scan, or 10 frames per second video. The actual video being sent back was not compatible with the 6 megahertz broadcast NTSC televisions that were in people's homes. Apollo 11 transmitted data to 3 ground stations on Earth during the moonwalk: Honeysuckle Creek and Parks in Australia and Goldstone in California. When these ground stations received the data, they had to immediately split the signal. One half of the signal remained unconverted, which went straight to the backup 14-track, 36-centimeter diameter, 25mm wide analog magnetic data tapes, which not only recorded the video signal, it also recorded the range, bio, and other telemetry data. These backup tapes would really only be used in the scenario where something went wrong in the mission, and or if Houston lost connection and data had to be looked at retrospectively. Spoiler, neither situation arose. So these backup tapes weren't considered that important after the mission, because the other half of the signal was converted via an RCA scan converter that converted the black and white slow scan to the NTSC TV standards for broadcast. Now, by today's standards, these converters weren't the most elegant solution. They were basically just a 25-centimeter video monitor that was showing the original slow scan video, and then it was shot with a conventional RCA TK22 TV camera. Yeah, that's not super high tech, and this led to low contrast, poor quality video. But one cool little thing is these converters did have an inversion switch to flip the picture upside down, because the camera was initially mounted upside down on the Mesa table, and it would need to be flipped and mounted right side up during the mission. So they physically flipped the switch, that flipped the image. I just think that's a fun little fact. This more conventional TV signal was then sent all around the world using microwave links, satellite and landlines to Houston, and from there it was sent off to New York to be broadcast via all TV networks simultaneously. Once that signal was in Houston and in TV stations all around the world, it was recorded via kinescope film and NTSC 2-inch quadruplex videotape. Now in the 90s, a 25th anniversary documentary suggested that the original uncompressed 25mm data tapes might be a better quality source of video compared to the universally available converted video. Unfortunately, despite looking everywhere, NASA was unable to find the source videotapes. This actually led to a pretty massive investigation within NASA. You can even read the full 20-page report that explains, perhaps there are no clear answers. All that can be said with any certainty is that NASA and the Goddard Space Flight Center followed all procedures in storing the Apollo telemetry tapes, the search team has concluded. After reviewing their content and determining that the Apollo program managers no longer needed that data, Goddard personnel shipped the telemetry tapes to Washington National Records Center for storage. Over the ensuing years, Goddard recalled them and either reused the 1-inch tapes to meet a network shortage in the early 1980s, or disposed of them because of the high cost of storing them. At no time did anyone recognize the unique content on roughly 45 tapes containing the actual moonwalk video. So it was a mix between diffusion of responsibility, a lack of these tapes being deemed necessary or worthy at the time, and it was unforeseeable that in the future, a digital restoration would be so valuable. And remember, not 1 second of the Apollo 11's mission video is missing, but unfortunately, it's just not in the highest quality that it could be. And importantly, some of the quality issues in conversion were greatly improved from Apollo 12 and beyond. So yeah, the source uncompressed raw tapes from Apollo 11's landings were lost. And it sucks. But luckily, there's hours and hours of beautiful, less compressed video from other missions and lots of gorgeous film from Apollo 11. Okay, so NASA did actually lose the highest quality tapes of Apollo 11's landing. But did NASA really lose the plans to the Saturn V rocket, and would it really be impossible for them to build it again? I've read it many times that NASA lost the plans to build the Saturn V and the Apollo spacecraft, and something along the lines of that it'd be impossible to build them again today. Well, that sure sounds convenient, doesn't it? It's quite suspicious that they can't just rebuild them all again today, isn't it? To the best of my knowledge, this idea came from a 1996 book called Mining the Sky by University of Arizona planetary science professor John Lewis, where he says to have been unable to find the Saturn V blueprints and that they were inexplicably lost. Following the publication of that book, Paul Shawcross of NASA's Office of Inspector General clarified that the physical blueprints were no longer kept, but that they recorded and copied every plan and every blueprint on microfiche, which was a popular way to archive information during the Saturn V and Apollo era. And today, thanks to the internet, we can easily find thousands of pages of blueprints, plans, and flight manuals. In fact, they definitely aren't lost. My shower curtain is blueprints of the Saturn V plans. But perhaps most importantly, any aerospace engineer worth their salary could easily reverse engineer and understand completely how the Saturn V works and was built. Now I should mention here, of course, that the detailed prints that you'd use to actually build a rocket is always going to fall under ITAR, International Traffic in Arms Regulations, and is not publicly available since rockets are formidable weapon delivery systems. But the exact blueprints for the Saturn V and the Apollo spacecraft are still kept, and NASA personnel and others with the right clearances can still access the full blueprints. Okay, so we have the plans, so why can't we just rebuild them and do these missions again today? Well, NASA can't build the Saturn V and the Apollo spacecraft today for the same reason that Ford can't just build a 1968 Mustang today. It's not that it's physically impossible, but logistically, it might as well be. The tools, the machines, vendors, and even the trades and talents that were used in the 1960s would be too hard to resurrect. And the reality is that We just don't do things the same way these days. A lot of things were hand-built, even in the F1 engines. For instance, the injector plates were drilled by hand, the welds were done by master welders, and parts were individually machined to perfection by skilled machinists. Imagine going out and trying to build a brand new computer with just 4 kilobytes of RAM today. Yeah, not megabytes or gigabytes, but 4 kilobytes of RAM. Or imagine trying to do core rope memory, where the data on the computer is literally hand woven into read-only memory. Why would you intentionally go back to primitive, archaic technology when we have things like carbon fiber, 3D printing, CAD, and modern microprocessors, etc., etc., etc.? Why would you possibly build an intentionally inferior product compared to the capabilities of today? Not to mention, in hindsight, the Apollo missions were incredibly risky. Far too risky for today's safety standards, especially for NASA in a post-Challenger and post-Columbia world. Speaking of blueprints, is it true that the lunar lander's walls were so thin you could poke a hole in them pretty easily? I've heard a horrifying fact about the lunar lander that has literally kept me up at night thinking about a worst-case scenario. I remember hearing that the hull was made of paper-thin aluminum and that you could poke a hole through it with a screwdriver. Is this true? Please tell me that's not true. Well, it is true that certain parts of the lunar module were so thin you could poke a hole through it with a screwdriver, or even worse, there's even some parts you could poke a hole through it with your finger even. But this is only true of some external parts of the spacecraft, but importantly, it's not true of the pressure hull itself. The outside of the spacecraft is covered in different thermal insulation and micrometeorite protection devices. The gold thermal foil you see is actually called multi-layer insulation, or MLI, and it's multiple layers of mostly aluminized mylar and Kapton to help provide a thermal insulation against radiative heat transfer. You could maybe poke your finger through this if you tried hard enough. But you might also see what looks almost like construction paper or cardboard on parts of the LEM as well. These are very thin pieces of aluminum that cover the actual hull to again provide insulation, but also micrometeorite protection. They're so thin you can actually see they could get deformed and come partially torn off when the ascent engine fired up. This was not ideal and was heavily studied after the fact. What is true is that the walls of the actual pressure vessel of the crew module were unbelievably thin in some spots. The skin was only about 0.15 millimeters thick in some areas, which is only about 50% thicker than a soda can. However, there's a few important details. First and foremost, it wasn't made out of cheap and soft 3000 series aluminum like that of soda cans. It was made out of heat-treated 2219 and 7075 aluminum alloys that are expensive, extremely high strength, and hard to manufacture. Another very important detail is that the pressure vessel was ribbed. There were structural braces throughout the entire thing to give it the adequate strength necessary to support the weight and loads of the mission. And lastly, the biggest reason why the walls could be and were so thin is because the vehicle only needed to operate in about 1/3 atmospheric pressure, or about 5 psi. This means there was much less force pushing out from the pressure compared to a vehicle that would be at 1 bar or 14.7 psi. A typical soda can hold about 6 bar or 90 psi of pressure. So that's 18 times more pressure than the pressure inside of the LEM. And with 50% thicker and stronger walls, we're talking about a surprisingly strong hull. All this means that the walls could be thinner and lighter weight, and therefore ultimately means that the rocket can be smaller. Every kilogram landed on the moon requires about 200 kilograms of rocket to get there. So in order to fit within the capabilities of the Saturn V, every single gram was carefully considered. So did the astronauts really have to be careful inside the LEM so as not to puncture the walls? I mean, yes, they had to be careful, but not really because the walls were so thin they could puncture them. Just look at how crammed the space was. There weren't even any spots of exposed hull wall where the astronauts could have even come in contact with. There was always some kind of interior layer, be it plastic or instrumentation. It was all covered and protected. Hundreds of switches, fuses, control panels, and instrument panels were crammed into every nook and cranny of the surface of the interior. They had to be careful so they didn't accidentally break something important or bump a switch inadvertently. In fact, on Apollo 11, somehow a vital circuit breaker switch was accidentally broken off at some point. They still don't know exactly how or when it broke off, but at one point, Buzz Aldrin looked down and saw a switch on the ground, and he thought, that's probably not good. Then he realized the switch that broke off was the circuit breaker to arm the ascent engine to get off of the moon. Very, very not good. After working the issue with Mission Control and pushing the ascent back a few hours for a new rendezvous opportunity, Buzz decided to try arming the circuit breaker with a felt tip pen. Luckily, obviously, as we know, it worked. Had it not, Buzz and Neil's bodies would likely still be on the moon today. Subsequent missions had a guard installed over this switch and other vital switches to avoid another near catastrophe. What's awesome is we have a lot of cool hardware sitting around all over the United States from the canceled Apollo missions, and we can go see this ourselves and we can see some of the design decisions and changes. Okay, we've spent a lot of time answering questions, but what about some interesting facts that are simply too important and too interesting to not go over? Okay, as we've seen, a lot of things look unusual on the moon, and many of these oddities stir up questions and conspiracies. But there's one unusual thing that actually proves that humans didn't just go to the moon, but that humans actually drove around on the moon. Watch the lunar dust get kicked up by the lunar roving vehicle during the famous Lunar Grand Prix on the Apollo 16 mission. This is some of the best proof that NASA could not have faked the Apollo missions by shooting this footage on Earth. If you go frame by frame and track the front wheel's rotation, like Professor Harani from the University of Colorado Boulder did, you can extrapolate the velocity of the rover on the moon, and then you can use the scale of the vehicle to correlate the height of the particles being thrown around by the rear wheels. You'll notice that the lunar particles are not affected by an atmosphere at all. Now, had this footage been faked on Earth, the particles would have slowed down along their trajectory from air resistance. Okay, well, maybe NASA could have filmed this in a giant vacuum chamber studio or something. Well, the other important thing to remember is that the particles also follow a trajectory that matches the moon's gravity at roughly 1/6 the Earth's gravity. So unless NASA has the technology to turn off or reduce gravity, this video was not filmed anywhere on Earth. The physics point to this footage being filmed on the moon. But for pretty much everything we've talked about, we still, to some degree, have to trust NASA's footage and words. What other evidence from outside of NASA is there? Why don't we just point a really powerful telescope at the moon and see if we can see the landing sites? Why haven't we aimed an observatory's telescope at the moon and just simply shown proof? Well, taking images of something that's only about 4 meters wide and 384,000 kilometers away really just can't be done on Earth because of atmospheric distortion, and it needs to be just insanely big to capture something so small at that distance. How big? Well, to truly resolve a 4-meter object from 384,000 kilometers, we'd need an optical telescope with an aperture of about 30 meters in diameter just to begin to be able to discern details that small from Earth. The world's largest ground-based optical telescope, Spain's Gran Telescopio Canarias, has an aperture of 10.4 meters. So you'd need a ground-based telescope with about 10 times the area to come close to being able to actually see the lunar lander with enough resolution to tell it's not just a boulder. Okay, but what about using Hubble or James Webb Space Telescopes? Well, unfortunately, Hubble can't do it. Hubble is in low Earth orbit only about 500 kilometers above the Earth. So at best, when it's between the Earth and the moon, it's only about 0.1% closer to the moon than we are, so it really isn't that much closer at all, despite the fact that it's in space. Hubble's Wide Field 3 camera has a field of view of about 2.6 arc minutes, meaning about 1/10 of the moon fills its entire field of view. Its angular resolution is 0.043 arc seconds for the 500 nanometer optical wavelengths and 0.026 arc seconds for 300 nanometer ultraviolet light. With its Wide Field Camera 3, it can resolve down to that 0.04 arc seconds per pixel. So the lunar lander would only take up a very small portion of a single pixel. So despite being a very powerful telescope that can see galaxies that are billions of light years away, it's just simply not the right choice for trying to photograph the Apollo landing sites. Okay, but what about using James Webb Space Telescope? I mean, it's bigger, better, newer, faster, stronger, it's a awesome telescope. And unfortunately, we can't use James Webb to point itself anywhere near the Earth or the moon due to needing to keep its solar shield strictly pointing at the sun so it can keep its instruments at the required negative 233 degrees Celsius. But let's forget about that for a second. It's actually worse than that because James Webb is about 4 times further away from the moon than Hubble is. And that's because James Webb is in the second Sun-Earth Lagrange point, which is about 1.5 million kilometers away from the Earth. And when the moon is closest to James Webb, it's actually the wrong side of the moon that's facing it, since all 6 Apollo missions landed on the Earth-facing side of the moon, because don't forget, the moon is tidally locked, meaning one side always faces the Earth. When the Apollo sites would start to become visible to James Webb pretty much from the side, the moon would still be a little bit further away from James Webb than it is from Earth, so at least 1.5 million kilometers away. And when the landing sites are actually lined up straight on, it'd be more like 1.9 million kilometers away. And with about the same resolution as Hubble, James Webb definitely wouldn't be an option to see the Apollo landing sites either. And it only can see in infrared, which wouldn't make for a great photograph. Okay, so what if we got a telescope even closer to the moon? Would it be possible to actually get a powerful enough telescope close enough to the moon to be able to see the Apollo landing sites? Yeah, and we've done that. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter was launched in 2009 and began mapping the surface of the moon as close as 35 kilometers from the surface. And guess what they found on the surface of the moon? That's right, the Apollo lunar landing sites. Well, actually, it's captured every human-made object, including Soviet Lunokhod rovers and crash sites and all sorts of incredible images. And these images have so much detail. You can clearly see the lunar lander descent stage, you can see footprints, and rover tracks. But what's really cool about these images from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter is you can compare these 21st century photos to video and images taken during liftoff from the moon of these missions, and you can literally align them and confirm that they're identical. Let's take the liftoff of Apollo 16, for example. It has great contrast and it's easy to see lots of detail as it ascends. Its pitch-over maneuver also shows the descent stage and some footprints as well. So we can overlay an image shot from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter and compare them. And look, they're identical. Nothing has changed since there's no wind or atmosphere to disrupt the lunar soil. I just absolutely love that something orbiting the moon today produces images that still correlate precisely with what was shot during the Apollo program. Oh, and by the way, I tracked the ascent myself using Adobe After Effects with its 3D camera tracker. And what's really cool is it's so accurate, you can actually see the exact ascent path plotted out. But in my opinion, it's awesome that I can literally do this stuff at home. But wait, this mission is still just footage from NASA. If someone has doubts about NASA's authenticity, then the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter just really isn't any further proof, is it? Well, yes, it is a NASA mission, but those who are actually in charge of the images isn't technically NASA. The group in charge of the LROC, or the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter camera, is from many different universities, including the University of Munster in Germany. Now, it's not to say that these universities and staff members couldn't be friendly towards NASA, but I'd imagine if they did capture images and find them to be inconsistent with historic images of the landing sites, it would be a huge story and a really big deal, and anyone in academia would be excited to publish those results. But it does still feel a little funny to prove something by pointing only to evidence given to us by the thing we're trying to prove, right? So has anyone else outside of NASA taken photos of any of the Apollo hardware on the surface of the moon? Yes! India's Chandrayaan-2 lunar orbiter has captured an image of the Apollo 11 and Apollo 12's lunar module descent stages. In fact, you can go to the ISRO Science and Data website yourself, create a free account, and download the raw images. These are huge files, like over a gigapixel of resolution, and the software you need to read these huge files is really slow. But if you know where to go, you can navigate right to it. Do you see it? No? Let's keep going. Now do you see it? There it is, that little tiny thing. If we zoom way in on it, you can pretty clearly make out the lunar lander and even its landing legs in the shadow. Now, the lighting conditions aren't quite right to see the footpaths of Apollo 11, but if we check out the Apollo 12 site, we can clearly see the footpaths. And again, all of this is downloaded straight from ISRO's government website. It's pretty amazing. But the cool thing about all this is that there's more and more things heading back to the moon. Now, don't forget the moon's the moon's big. So it's not like just because you land on the moon, you're gonna look over and see something that landed previously, unless you try. Like how the Apollo 12 crew intentionally landed close enough to just go and walk and inspect Surveyor 3. It's just so epic to me that they just went up and touched something that has already traveled from the Earth to the moon. I don't know why, I just think that's extra cool for some reason. And with even more things heading back to the moon than ever before, there's even more and more chances that, other missions will get imagery of these landing sites, especially from countries outside of the United States. So stay tuned, because I think this is just gonna keep increasing. Okay, so we do have some images, but what about other data? Did anyone else track the Apollo missions? Of course, there were people outside of NASA who tracked the Apollo missions. Just like how the United States tracked Soviet missions, the Soviets tracked NASA missions. The Soviet Union was actually the leader in spaceflight technology, having beat the United States in almost every imaginable way. From the first satellite in orbit, to the first human in space and in orbit, to the first extravehicular activity, the Soviets were way ahead. And this also means the Soviets had similar technology to the United States when it came to tracking spacecraft. In fact, the Apollo 11 mission was the first time the Soviets and the US space programs had any formal communication and any kind of collaboration. It just so happens the Soviets were in a race with the Americans to the moon. And I mean this quite literally, maybe a lot more literally than you might imagine, because during Apollo 11, the Soviets were specifically trying to return lunar samples from the moon before the Americans. Now, of course, the Soviets were trying to get humans on the moon eventually. However, at this moment, they were doing this with a robotic lander called Luna 15. The fact that Luna 15 and Apollo 11 were attempting to land at roughly the same time prompted communications between the two countries. The Soviets ended up publishing their trajectories and the frequencies used so as not to potentially harm the Apollo 11 mission. That's right, the Soviets, the Cold War enemies of the United States, actually gave away some of their closely guarded secrets. They gave away the exact frequencies they used so as not to potentially interfere with vital communications, as well as the exact trajectory of the spacecraft to ensure there was no chance of collision, no matter how small that chance was. But just here for perspective, it didn't even take countries to track missions like this. In fact, the Jodrell Bank radio telescope tracked and captured the Soviets' Luna 9 mission, which led to the British press actually publishing photos from the surface of the moon before the Soviets did. But even the Kettering Grammar School in England was calculating orbits of spacecraft to study Doppler and Faraday effects on a large scale. They were so good at tracking and calculating orbits that they found the first public evidence of the secret Pleshtek launch site in the Soviet Union. They also managed to track and calculate the orbit of Apollo 17 on its way to the moon. The point is, the Apollo missions weren't done in a vacuum. Wait, I mean, yeah, I guess they literally were done in a vacuum, but what I mean is they weren't done entirely in secrecy. There were independent sources that were verifying the progress and tracking the missions in real time. I mean, after all, the United States was at war with the Soviets. If they had any reason to think that we didn't go to the moon, or they had any reason to suspect the United States had faked it, wouldn't they have been the first to cry foul? Perhaps one of the biggest proofs to me that the United States took humans to the moon during the Apollo program is that the Soviet Union didn't deny it. In fact, beyond the cooperation of ensuring that the Luna 15 mission didn't interfere with the Apollo 11 mission, the Soviets also offered to cooperate in a rescue mission of the Apollo 13 crew had that been necessary. Not only did they send 4 ships out towards the approximate landing areas, a premier from the Soviet Union told the United States that the Soviet government gave an order to all Soviet citizens and armed forces to use all necessary means to assist in a rescue if necessary. If the Soviets had any reason to suspect these missions were at all fake, even if a part of the missions were exaggerated or false, you'd better believe an act of cooperation like this simply would not have happened, and instead, they would have been blowing the whistle. And even recently, amidst new tensions between the United States and Russia, the head of Russia's space agency, Yuri Borisov, made a public statement that Russian scientists examined a sample of lunar soil given to the Soviet Union during the Apollo program. He said, "As for whether Americans were on the moon or not, I have only one fact. I looked into this matter. They once gave us a sample of the lunar soil delivered by the astronauts during that expedition. An examination by our Academy of Sciences confirmed that it is exactly lunar soil. So, with all the reason in the world to denounce the United States' Apollo landings, an independent scientific study again verifies it, specifically from a nation not particularly aligned with the United States at the moment. Okay, sure. Maybe we did land on the moon, but one thing still feels fishy. If we had the hardware to get to the moon in 1969, why haven't we gotten anywhere close to that distance to the moon since then? For over 50 years, humans didn't even get 1/1000th the distance to the moon. And in 2024, Polaris Dawn finally did get closer, but still only about 1/300th the distance to the moon. Isn't the fact that we haven't gotten anywhere close to the moon again proof that we probably never went there in the first place? Between 1972 and 2024, humans never made it beyond 600 kilometers in altitude from the surface of the Earth. The post-Apollo record was held for a majority of the time by the Space Shuttle's Hubble missions, when it deployed it and eventually serviced it. But as of the making of this video in 2024, 4 humans finally broke the shuttle's record and flew to an altitude of over 1,400 kilometers on the Polaris Dawn mission. It was a private mission on SpaceX's Crew Dragon capsule that also performed the first commercial EVA, or extravehicular activity, or spacewalk. And as impressive as these missions were, not one human has even gotten 1% as close to the moon as the Apollo program. So not just half the distance to the moon, but literally only about 0.3% of the way there. So way off. What gives? For this section, we're purely going to talk about orbital mechanics. In the next section, we'll get into delta V and the rocket equation. And lastly, we'll get into the real big question of why haven't we gone back to the moon since the Apollo program? If we are to explain how NASA got humans to the moon, we need to be able to do the math ourselves, so we don't have to take NASA's word for it. We're going to use the same math used by the Soviets, or now Russia, by China, India, or really anyone who wants to get something to the moon, or go anywhere in space. Now bear with me, but we're first going to go into a little tangent here in order to understand what orbiting is and how velocity affects your orbit, so we can truly grasp orbital mechanics before we dive into the math. First, let's learn 2 important terms, apogee and perigee. Apogee is the highest point in your orbit around Earth, and perigee is the lowest point around Earth. Now notice that I'm saying around Earth. The words apogee and perigee are specific to objects orbiting Earth. Apolune and perilune are terms for orbiting the moon, and apohelion and perihelion are terms for orbiting the sun. But apoapsis and periapsis is the general term regardless of what body an object is orbiting. To raise your orbit, you need to speed up, and on the opposite side of the body you're orbiting, the orbit will raise. If you slow down, the opposite side of your orbit will lower. Okay, so keep these concepts in mind as we explain the next part. My favorite way to visualize getting into orbit is to imagine you took a ride on Blue Origin's New Shepard suborbital spacecraft. New Shepard goes straight up and straight back down, just barely crossing the Kármán line or the edge of space before falling back down to Earth, giving its passengers about 4 minutes of wonderful views and 0G. Now imagine if right at apogee, or the peak of the trajectory, you opened the hatch and threw a ball out the hatch at 15 meters per second. It flies sideways relative to you, but in the grand scheme of things, it'll mostly just end up falling right back down and landing pretty close to where you land. The best way to visualize how this relates to orbit is to imagine the ball is orbiting around the center of the Earth at just a very tiny little point, and its perigee, or its lowest point, would just barely make it beyond the center of the Earth. This is because the velocity at our highest point is very low. So to raise our lowest point, or our perigee, we need to increase our velocity at our apogee, or our peak. So what if instead of throwing a ball at apogee, we shot a bullet out of a pistol at 350 meters per second? Well, the bullet will travel much further away than the ball, but it will still collide with the atmosphere and then the ground. And again, if we visualize where its orbital path would go if it could go through the Earth, its perigee, or its lowest point, would actually rise away from the center. So its perigee is higher because it was traveling faster at apogee. See where this is going? Let's step it up even more. Let's fire a sniper rifle that can shoot around at 1,400 meters per second. Again, the bullet will go even further, but gravity will still win, and the bullet will still run into the atmosphere and then the ground. And if we again visualize where the orbit would go compared to the center of the Earth, its perigee would be even higher yet, again because its velocity is higher at apogee. So in order to get into orbit and basically miss the atmosphere, we need to reach a velocity of roughly 7.8 kilometers per second, which is 28,000 kilometers an hour, or about 17,500 miles an hour. At this velocity, our arc will go beyond the horizon and it'll miss the atmosphere and the Earth entirely. So obviously, rockets need to reach this velocity to get into orbit around Earth. Okay, now that we have that, now we're in low Earth orbit, we need to raise our orbit to get out to the moon. The moon is about 384,000 kilometers from Earth. And let's imagine that we are starting at a low Earth orbit altitude of 300 kilometers and our velocity is 7.8 kilometers per second. How much do you think we need to speed up in order to raise our orbit to have its apogee reach all the way out to where the moon's orbit is? Well, let's find out. So first we take our starting altitude, so 300 kilometers. But now for this equation, we need to know the distance from the center of the Earth. So 300 kilometers plus the radius of the Earth, so 6,378 kilometers, for a total of 6,678 kilometers. Now we're going to calculate the circular orbital velocity, which equals the square root of the gravitational parameter of Earth divided by the orbital radius. Earth's gravitational parameter is 398,600 cubic kilometers per second squared, which is a known figure thanks to the Cavendish experiment done in 1798. Okay, so let's divide the gravitational parameter by our orbital radius, so that's 6,678, which gives us 59.7 square kilometers per second squared. Now we just get the square root of 59.7 square kilometers per second, and we get 7.73 kilometers per second. Look, we literally just figured out how fast an object is traveling when at 300 kilometers in altitude. Now, empowered with knowing how to do this, we need to figure out the elliptical orbit's semi-major axis. So in other words, when we do the translunar injection burn to the moon, we will raise our orbit so that it's a very elliptical orbit with the apogee being all the way to where the moon is. Or more specifically, where the moon's going to be when we get there. The semi-major axis of an elliptical orbit is just the average of the center of the Earth to apogee and the center of the Earth to perigee, which equals 195,339 kilometers for our semi-major axis. Now we just need to find the velocity of an object at the perigee of an elliptical orbit, because it's going fastest at perigee and it's going slowest at apogee. This is equal to the gravitational parameter multiplied by the difference between 2 divided by the perigee radius and 1 divided by the semi-major axis. So if we solve within the parentheses first, you get 0.00029,458 inverse kilometers. Then we multiply that by the gravitational parameter, so 117.4 square kilometers per second square. Now we just find the square root of that to get 10.83 kilometers per second, or about 39,000 kilometers an hour, or about 24,000 miles an hour. And that right there is how fast an object needs to be traveling to get from low Earth orbit to the moon. But don't forget, our velocity in low Earth orbit is already 7.73 kilometers per second, so that means we only need a burn of about 3.1 kilometers per second to do a translunar injection. Okay, all this to say, despite low Earth orbit being only about 1/1000th the distance to the moon, it really only takes about 40% more delta V to get there. So it's not even close to 1,000 times more delta V or energy to get from low Earth orbit to the moon. However, don't forget, this is just what it takes to get you out to the moon. But to actually land on the moon, you first have to get into lunar orbit and then land on the moon, and then you have to get back into lunar orbit, and then you have to come home. So yeah, this is just getting you from low Earth orbit to the moon. But in all reality, 3.1 additional kilometers per second is actually quite a lot of energy for a rocket to expend that's already in low Earth orbit. Especially when you consider that Saturn V had to lift about 45 metric tons to the moon from low Earth orbit. That's more mass than most rockets can even put into orbit in the first place, let alone they definitely couldn't push that mass around once they're already in low Earth orbit. So let's get even deeper into the math and see if the Saturn V and the lunar lander and the command and service module actually had the amount of energy it takes to really do this entire mission to the moon and back by calculating the delta V capability of every stage of the rocket. If we can figure this out, we can really figure out how this was all possible. There's no denying that NASA launched 13 Saturn V rockets, and 11 of those had humans on board. I mean, literally hundreds of thousands of people gathered to watch them launch live. They were some of the most watched events in human history. There should be no denying that the Saturn V was capable of at least getting to orbit, and probably to the moon, considering it was the largest and most powerful rocket at the time. But that said, do the numbers actually add up? If you were to reverse engineer the rocket, does it really have what it takes to get people to the moon, and more importantly, get them back home? Now, naysayers might say something like, well, it'd be easy to fudge these numbers or falsify these capabilities, but actually it's easy to verify the numbers that we'll be using here in this section. Because first off, you can't falsify the dimensions when these objects still physically exist in museums where you can measure and figure out all the volumes of the tanks, and when you combine those with known figures for the materials and the densities of the propellants, you can validate the numbers quite easily. Now, when it comes to engines, it does get a little bit tougher to directly validate the figures. I mean, we can't just go grab an F1 engine and set it up on a test stand and fire it and see how much thrust it produces. But I will say that engines like the F1 or even the J2 on the Saturn V are actually pretty modest performing engines, at least in today's standards. I mean, the F1, although it's large and high in thrust, is actually pretty poor in terms of efficiency. And it's the same thing with the J2. It was a very decent engine. It was high thrust for a Hydrolox engine, but it was actually pretty poor efficiency-wise compared to engines that are operating today. So it's not like the engines on the Saturn V, were just really anything outside of ordinary in terms of, I guess, anything other than sheer scale. Okay, now in this section, we're going to dive deep into the rocket equation to solve delta V, or the change in velocity. Now you can think of delta V like the range of a car. So basically a combination of how efficient is the engine and how big is the gas tank. To help make learning delta V easy, let's start off with a single stage suborbital rocket, the Redstone rocket with the Mercury capsule on top. Okay, so to solve for delta V, we need to know our wet mass, or our starting mass, which is how heavy the rocket is when fully fueled, or at least how heavy it is at the start of our burn that we're trying to calculate. And we need to know our dry mass, or the final mass, which is how heavy it is when it's empty or at the end of the burn that we're trying to calculate. But it does need to include the mass of the payload, or any stage on top of it that has propellant not being utilized in the burn. Then we need to know the performance of the engine based on its exhaust gas velocity in meters per second, which we can convert from the more commonly published figure, which is specific impulse, by just simply multiplying it by 9.8. Then we just take that exhaust gas velocity times the natural log of the wet mass divided by the dry mass, and we get the delta V. Now I should point out here again that delta V isn't a fixed number for each rocket. It depends on the payload mass. Since the payload affects the wet mass and the dry mass, changing the mass of the payload changes the delta V. This is why rockets can launch more to low Earth orbit than they can to, say, a geostationary orbit, or than they can launch off to the moon. Now for the Apollo moon missions, trying to figure out the delta V of each part of the mission gets quite complicated because some stages make 2 burns, or in the case of the command module, it does a burn when pushing the fully fueled lunar lander and another without the lunar lander. By figuring out the delta V of each stage, we can double check the capabilities and see if it actually adds up to be able to do the mission to the moon and back. But let's start this whole thing off backwards. What's it take to actually get off of the moon? If we know this, we can figure out how big of a vehicle we need to land on the moon and how big of a rocket we need to get all of that to the moon. The ascent stage had a dry mass of 2,445 kilograms and had 2,376 kilograms of hypergolic propellant, giving it a wet mass of 4,821 kilograms. The ascent engine, or the ascent propulsion system, was a pressure-fed, hypergolic, ablatively cooled engine capable of 311 seconds of specific impulse. So by those numbers, we can see that the ascent stage had about 2,070 meters per second of delta V. This is a decent margin above the 1,725 meters per second needed to get into lunar orbit, which is good because they would also have additional mass of lunar samples, and they would want plenty of margin to rendezvous with the command module that was already in lunar orbit that would get them back to Earth. Okay, so next let's do the math on the descent stage. The descent stage on its own had a dry mass of 2,034 kilograms and had 8,345 kilograms of propellant, giving it a wet mass of 10,379 kilograms. But this is where things get just a little more complicated, because we need to include the mass of the fully fueled ascent stage, that 4,821 kilograms, in the wet mass and the dry mass for this equation for the descent stage, since they were attached during descent to the moon's surface. The descent stage was powered by the VTR-10, a pressure-fed hypergolic ablatively cooled engine that also produced 311 seconds of specific impulse. And if we run these numbers, we see the descent stage had about 2,427 meters per second of delta V. That means they had a huge margin of about 700 meters per second, probably because they needed to be able to maneuver to avoid craters and boulders like we saw during Apollo 11. This makes sense, and again, so far, the math checks out. Okay, but what about the command and service module? It had a dry mass of 11,900 kilograms and had 16,900 kilograms of propellant, giving it a wet mass of 28,800 kilograms. But again, figuring out the delta V of its burns gets even more complicated, because when it did the burn to get into lunar orbit from the translunar injection, it had to push around the mass of the fully fueled lunar lander, which was an additional 15,200 kilograms of mass that we need to add to the wet mass and the dry mass. It requires roughly 850 meters per second of delta V to get into and out of lunar orbit, give or take. You can actually do it with less or more depending on your final orbit and what your altitude is and what you come in at after your translunar injection, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is, about 850 meters per second is a nice middle ground. The Apollo service module used an AJ-10 engine that achieved 314 seconds of specific impulse and was also pressure-fed, hypergolic, and ablatively cooled. Okay, so we need to burn enough propellant to get us 850 meters per second of delta V for our orbital insertion burn. And since we're not doing a burn to depletion here, let's not call it wet mass and dry mass. Let's switch to calling it initial mass and final mass for this burn. It's the same thing, but it just makes more sense for this. So if we consume 10,625 kilograms of propellant, we'll have 6,275 kilograms of propellant left over, which needs to be included in our final mass number, and that will get us the 850 meters per second of delta V needed for the orbital insertion burn. So after the lunar lander landed on the moon, and then when the ascent stage met back up with the command module in lunar orbit, they would unload the ascent stage and then detach it before they did the trans-Earth injection burn, which again requires 850 meters per second of delta V. So the command and service module had a dry mass of 11,900 kilograms and had 6,275 kilograms of propellant remaining, giving us a wet mass of 18,175 kilograms. So this means they had about 1,300 meters per second of delta V to do the burn home from lunar orbit. This is plenty of margin, which is good because there might need to be some maneuvers during rendezvous and mid-course corrections and such, not to mention the additional mass of lunar samples that they were bringing back home. So yeah, things are so far checking out with plenty of margin by the math. So now I guess the ultimate question. Now that we know that the service module could have gotten the fully fueled lunar lander into lunar orbit, and that the lunar lander could have gotten to the surface and back into orbit, and that then the service module could have then got the crew home, the biggest question remains. Was the Saturn V actually a big enough rocket to get 44 metric tons all the way to the moon? That's a lot of mass. Considering that a good-sized rocket like the Atlas V in its largest configuration can't even get 44 metric tons into orbit, period, was the Saturn V really that much more capable? Well, let's run the numbers. For this, we can start on the ground because we know how much mass we need to get to the moon. So let's start off with the S1C, the massive first stage of the Saturn V. The S1C had a dry mass of 290 tons and had a ridiculous 1,990 tons of propellant, giving it a wet mass of 2,280 tons. But now the fun begins. The S1C had to lift the entire rest of the stack off the ground, which means we need to include the weight of the fully fueled second stage, third stage, the lunar lander and command module, which was 647 tons of mass. This of course means we have to add